Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 338 part 2. Well, there's plenty more questions to be getting on with, so let's be getting on with them. DM Phoenix asks, I was enjoying a rewatch of your video on USS Franklin, but then soon found myself a little more upset by the actions of her commanding officer, one Captain Leslie E. Gehres. In lieu of one of your dedicated videos on admirals, what's your quick hot take on Captain, later Rear Admiral Gehres? Was his reputation as a toxic leader deserved, or did he have any redeeming qualities, perhaps one that justified promotion to Rear Admiral? Well, during that video, I took a deeper look into his background to work out, what exactly was going on with him, because there were a few conflicting accounts of what went on aboard Franklin, and of course he was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions. One of the probably least earned Navy Crosses of the period, but never mind. And the really, really short summary would be that Gehres appears to have all of Halsey's aggression and none of Halsey's people skills, but that is perhaps being a little bit too short. Essentially, he was an incredibly aggressive person in terms of, wanting to attack the enemy all the time, but I've come across his type both in naval history and in real life, perhaps more often than I'd prefer, and I suspect a lot of you have as well. So if I describe a person who is incredibly aggressively motivated to get the results they want, absolutely refuses to consider that they might be at fault in any way, shape or form for any mistakes along the way to getting what they want, and if they do make a mistake that in some way badly impedes them from getting what they want, they throw an absolute fit and blame everybody else instead of accepting that they might have been even partially responsible. Which is exacerbated by the fact they're incredibly frustrated and angry because they're not getting what they want, and then that compounds into an ever-growing circle of wrath and, taking it out on everyone nearby. And yes, we're also describing a very disobedient 2 to 3 year old toddler, but I'm sure you've run into that kind of person quite a bit in the workplace or in college or whatever. That, to my mind, seems to be the personality of Gehres. As long as people are cooperating with his goal of, in this case, attacking lots of Japanese, then he's just another slightly more authoritarian, hard-charging officer. The minute anything potentially gets in his way, whether that be pre-existing damage to the ship requiring the ship to not sail immediately, or in the case of Franklin being bombed, there's some indication that his actions before the bombing either enabled it or made it worse to a certain degree, and then his ship is bombed. So, he's standing there looking at Franklin on fire, knowing that this is now going to massively get in the way of what he actually wants to do, which is make a name for himself attacking Japanese installations on warships. He also knows in the back of his mind he's probably at least partially responsible for this due to his command decisions in the immediate run-up to the bombing, but he can't accept that. He can't possibly be at fault, and yet the ship is on fire. Therefore, it has to be somebody else's fault. It's everybody else's fault but his. And if it's everybody else's fault, then he has to find and take it out on the people who are at fault. And, well, obviously the ship could have been less on fire if there were more people on board. Therefore, the people who weren't on board, it's their fault that everything went this badly. Completely disregarding, of course, the fact they were blown over the side by the bomb blast. That's irrelevant. So, yeah, I think his reputation is very much deserved. And you can kind of see what the US Navy thought of it in terms of, much like Admiral Wright, the commander at the Battle of Tassafaronga, although he was allowed to remain in the Navy, he was never again given command of a US Navy ship at sea. If there was any redeeming quality at all, and there's potential ways of interpreting even this uncharitably, He was a Commodore, and he took a step down in rank to enable him to command Franklin. So you could read that as, he was willing to take a pay cut in order to go after the Japanese. Of course, you could also read that as he was willing to do absolutely anything to make his name. But it appears that once he was back ashore, obviously he would very rapidly revert to his old rank, and therefore, simply by seniority, he would reach the next level up, which would be Rear Admiral, as long as he stayed in the service long enough, which was for a few more years after the war. Anton Alert asks, I'll admit it took me a good long while to realise the necessity of counter-flooding. I mean, why would you want to add more water to a ship that already had too much? But having realised that capsizing is very, very bad, it leaves me with a question. How does one counter-flood and do it well? Are there specific tables to guide a captain as to where to let in more water? Are there specific voids in the hull to allow for an influx of water? Or could I just flood any old compartment if needs must? It depends very much on the era, but for the World War II era, you do have a lot more options. Back in the World War I era, there are less options available to you, and you'll probably understand why as I explain. So, during World War II, most ships, at least most large ships, had a liquid, void, or void, liquid, basically a sandwich layer torpedo defense system, if they were any real size. Now, of course, the void areas are empty, and you have to have pumping systems connected to them in case they get flooded and you want to pump them back out again. So if you are flooding on one side because you have taken a torpedo hit or something, then one of the easiest things to do is to flood the void segments of your torpedo defense system on the other side, because for one thing, you're not flooding anything internal to the ship, which would be more important. And, of course, the torpedo defense system is furthest out on the beam of the ship, which means that the water you admit will have the greatest possible counterbalancing effect. Most ships will also have trim tanks and ballast tanks, and you can either fill them if they're empty or part full in the opposite direction. So obviously, logically, if you're flooding on the starboard side, you flood on the port side, but US Navy damage control handbooks suggest also it might be a good idea to counter-flood diagonally, because obviously if you have, let's say, a hit on your starboard aft quarter, if you flood your port aft quarter, you'll correct the list, but you'll now be heavily down by the stern, whereas if you counter-flood your port bow quarter, then you'll still be down, but you'll also be in trim, which is better. So, yeah, ballast tanks and trim tanks can be flooded if they're empty. Also, fuel tanks, if they happen to be empty. And another element of counter-flooding may just be moving liquids around. So, again, for example, if you have half-empty fuel tanks, then you could start pumping fuel from again, assuming we've been hit on the starboard side, start pumping fuel from the fuel tanks on the starboard side, which makes the starboard side lighter, and move them to the tanks on the port side, which makes the port side heavier. That doesn't actually technically add any more liquid to the ship, but it does do something to even out the ship's heel. If your torpedo defense system liquid layers are also accessible, because obviously on some systems they're just open to the sea, in others the liquid layer is also a fuel tank, then you could also look at pumping out the ones on the side that have been hit, and if you've obviously got empty liquid layers or part empty liquid layers on the other side, you can transfer the fuel over to them. Some ships, although very few, will have purpose-built-in counter-flooding tanks, but that's so rare in World War II as to basically be a non-entity. And in an absolute emergency, you can also identify compartments on the opposite side of the ship, which you don't necessarily need access to right this instant, which could be flooded if you need even more counter-flooding, although that's usually going to be the case on a ship that perhaps doesn't have a complex torpedo defense system and a whole system of fuel tanks, which will either be an older or smaller ship. Because if you're on a big ship like a fast battleship or a modern aircraft carrier, and you've counter-flooded your torpedo defense system and you've counter-flooded your ballast and trim tanks, and pumped fuel around, etc., etc., and your list is still nowhere near being corrected to the point that people are now looking at perhaps opening store spaces and so forth to the sea, you've probably already taken on far too much water for the ship to be saved. Hamilcar Barker asks, did you ever download the General Quarters 3 rules I sent you? And second, I've just purchased French Warships in the Age of Sail 1786 to 1861 by Winfield and Roberts. To me, it's a very good resource for the smaller ships that many other books don't cover. What's your opinion? Well, I'm pretty sure I did download those General Quarters 3 rules, otherwise I'd have to explain by some other method how I got my hands on them, so thank you very much. And in terms of the book, yes, it's an absolutely brilliant book. And in fact, the Winfield series, as I like to call it, covers a huge range for the Age of Sail and is absolutely necessary if you want to trace down the details of pretty much every ship involved in that time period. So there's French warships in the Age of Sail, obviously 1786 to 1861, as you've got there, but there's a whole load of others. So there's, again, French warships in the Age of Sail 1626 to 1786, which is kind of the predecessor to that. There's Dutch warships in the Age of Sail 1600 to 1741. Spanish warships in the Age of Sail 1700 to 1860. And then a whole series on British warships in the Age of Sail, the last one being 1817 to 1863. But there are 3 predecessor volumes, 1603 to 1714, 1714 to 1792, and 1792 to 1817. So there's 4 books for the British warships collection. And it is to a certain degree a little bit of an ongoing series because the Spanish warships one was published fairly recently, and I'm sure the eagle-eyed amongst you might have spotted that the Dutch warships one obviously terminates somewhat before the Age of Sail does. So who knows, we might get a later section for Dutch warships at some point. There are a few other similar books that cover other navies. There's one for Russian warships by, I'm just looking over my shoulder, John Tredair, I think. And so obviously that'll cover the Russian vessels. But yeah, if you can get a good hand on Winfield's book series, you will know the identity and fate of pretty much every ship to sail the seas for those various navies in their time periods. John McCarthy asks, track charts are bewildering, to me anyway. To make sense of them, you need to study them and imagine the locations of the ships as the battle progresses. Do you know of an app that translates a track chart into a movie or maybe a series of stills? Sadly, I do not. This is one of a series of track charts produced by the Imperial German Navy for the Battle of Jutland, and this is probably one of the most understandable sets of track charts that are produced. Mostly because they cover very specific time periods in the battle. If you look at the Royal Navy's official track charts for the Battle of Jutland that cover most of the battle, it just looks like a mad attack of spaghetti. Unfortunately, I don't think an app that easily translates the track charts into a movie or a series of stills either exists or is going to exist at any point in the near future, partly because people tend to do their track charts very differently. So you can see here the Germans' style, at least in World War One. The British style is much less and more information dense at the same time. So there's lots more colours, but a lot thinner track points, and you don't have these kind of neat formation diagrams. It'll just be little markers. If you look at World War II track charts, quite a lot of the time they're not even colour, they're a mixture of, well, it's just black and white, but the line markings are instead just, solid line, dash line, dotted line, dot dash line, etc. with a key. Font choice for timestamp markers, etc. It's all different. So getting something that comprehends what it's looking at and what you want it to do, yeah, I suspect that's going to take a little bit of time for somebody to work out. There have been track charts that have been animated into movies or stills, but that's all been done by hand, which, yeah, that takes a while, because essentially the best way to do that is, if you're doing it digitally, would be to import the track chart into something where a fairly advanced graphics editor where you can do multiple layers, and then place your own little markers at the beginning of each track point with your own labels. So, this is this ship, this is that ship, they're all in these positions at these times, and have all that in a layer, then duplicate the layer and move all those markers to their next noted point in time. And once those are all roughly coordinated, and if there's separate time markers, you have to make an interpolation, then save that, and then copy the layer, repeat with the next timestamp sections, etc., etc. And then in theory, if you turn those layers on and off in sequence, you'll get a kind of slideshow going through, or a series of separate slides that you can look at. In theory, now that I have some basic Blender skills, as you've probably seen in the Cruisers and Destroyer Actions video, in theory I could try and put a track chart down as a plane, and then put the little 3D models that I use on top, and essentially do that whole process in 3D digital, and see if that would work. But essentially at the moment it's all handcrafting to make sense of the track charts. Ian Carr asks, I was interested to note that HMS Renown, generally regarded as having had an active and good World War II, had 5 captains in that period, none of whose names I recognise. Why? And was it a general policy of the Royal Navy to publicise the ship rather than the individuals after successes, and more so the individual following failures that resulted in court-martials or inquiries? Well, it's interesting because 2 of those captains made full admiral, and one of them even became admiral of the fleet in the aftermath of World War II. But more generally, the Royal Navy, at least in the World War I, World War II period, usually did make it a policy of naming ships when it came to noting successes. And there are a variety of reasons. Partly it was just the operational security of not naming individuals. Partly it was also because, obviously, as you can see by the fact Renown having 5 captains, captains can come and go, whereas a ship, as long as it's not sunk, sticks around. So by giving the ship a reputation, that can help overawe the enemy a bit more, because if you hear, oh well, this captain's coming, well, hang on a minute, what is he captain of? Has he been captain of this ship for long? Did he get his reputation as captain of a completely different ship? That's not really going to strike fear into your opponents. Whereas here comes HMS Renown, the ship that just fights anything that you put in front of it and has to be physically held back from going after Bismarck. That's a lot more scary. There's also a morale element back home, because if somebody looks on a news broadcast or listens to the radio, and you hear, oh well, Captain so-and-so in charge of HMS Renown did this, that and the other, the focus is on the captain. Whereas if you say, the captain and crew of HMS Renown did such and such, well, with a crew of high hundreds, low thousand people aboard, then there's a fairly high chance that a non-insignificant number of friends and family of men who are aboard the ship are going to be listening, or people who were aboard the ship before or are hoping to get on the ship. And at that point, if you're making it about the ship and the crew as a whole, for the families and friends of those aboard, they'll be like, my husband, brother, son, relative, boyfriend, etc., he's doing something really good, I'm really proud of him. And for people who were on the ship, yeah, good old Renown, go get the enemy. And for people who are looking for a ship, I think I might want to serve aboard Renown. That's a lot more productive for morale back home than just saying, oh well, this captain did this. And to be honest, even when there were failures, the general policy seems to just be to say a Royal Navy force of, X cruisers, Y destroyers. They very often wouldn't even name a ship unless it had been sunk. And if it was a specific thing that resulted in a court-martial, even then you'd quite often just hear the captain or whoever has been court-martialed or subject to an inquiry. Even then, naming an individual would usually only be done if there was a specific conviction afterwards, and or it was held that the actions in that particular case had been so bad they essentially wanted to publicly shame the captain, which they usually didn't, because a lot of court-martials were more pro forma. Yes, your ship has been sunk, therefore we have to hold a court-martial, but everybody's going into that knowing that there was probably very little other captain could have done better. And even in cases where someone was actually convicted by court-martial for something like the loss of their ship or damage to their ship, it may be on a technicality or it may be on a slightly split decision. And even in those cases, you don't necessarily want to throw that person to the wolves. Al Sadius asks, in the Washington Treaty, there was a provision that essentially forbade the US and the UK from fortifying any Pacific bases between Pearl Harbor and Hong Kong. How much did this help Japan in the end? Would these bases realistically have been fortified enough to slow down Japan to any significant extent? It helped Japan a little bit. I would say that the British provisions probably didn't change all that much, because aside from Hong Kong, there wasn't really much in the area that was supposed to not be fortified that the British controlled and actually cared all that much about, or was really all that viable for major defence. You could argue perhaps some British fortification on the Chinese coast, maybe at Weihai Wei or something, but that's fairly impractical and would be very easily cut off. Potentially fortifying Hong Kong would have allowed it to hold out a little bit longer, but ultimately they were allowed to fortify Singapore, and they didn't manage to get the money and resources together in time to fully fortify that place, as you can see in part by the fall of Singapore, at which point being able to split your fortification money between a couple of additional places probably wouldn't help much at all, really. The clauses for the Americans, I think that probably helped the Japanese a little bit more, if for no other reason than there's the big obvious Philippines-shaped part, which falls directly into the area you're not supposed to improve fortifications on. And, of course, that was a major Japanese target right from the word go. Now, of course, there were some existing fortifications, like the Corregidor batteries, Fort Drum, etc. But between the signing of the Washington Naval Treaty and the outbreak of World War II, aside from general maintenance and upgrades to those facilities, the US wasn't supposed to do anything more. And I think there's possibly an argument there that if they had been allowed to fortify the Philippines considerably more, so perhaps adding more Fort Drum style installations, very extensive anti-aircraft batteries, coastal artillery, etc., etc., it might not have stopped the Japanese, but it certainly would have inflicted a lot more casualties and held them up for a lot longer. And in those early days, when Japan seemed to be unstoppable, just going from place to place to place occupying, just delaying them for a few months and causing them casualties to their invasion shipping probably would have put a serious spanner in the works of Japanese expansion. ACC asks, has the naval design principle of speed will be our armour ever been an unqualified success? Kind of, maybe. I think it depends on exactly how you qualify. If you mean, if you put one ship that's faster but less well protected against another ship that's slower but better protected and have them fight it out in a slugging match, and the faster ship uses its speed to evade incoming fire, I don't think anyone's really managed to pull that off for very long. But there are a lot of situations where a ship has been designed for speed or has made certain sacrifices in other things in exchange for speed, and that speed has come back to help them and probably almost certainly prevented their destruction. So, for example, the reason this picture is up here, the Queen Elizabeth class, there were design options to have a Queen Elizabeth class with more armour. There were design options to have one with 10 guns for 5 twin turrets. But in the end, they opted for the 8-gun armament, the 13-inch armour, and the, 25 knot target speed, 24 knots on a good day for most of them. But it's very, very easy to argue that if they hadn't had that speed margin, then when they were left out to dry by Beatty and company at Windy Corner, as depicted here, without that speed, they wouldn't have been able to get out from under German fire as quickly as they did, and then probably would have lost at least one of their members. Likewise, in the War of 1812, the fact that a number of the US frigates were very fast meant that they were able to close down and force engagements on their terms when they wanted to, but also they were able to decline engagements, for the most part, with much larger superior forces, and therefore live to fight another day. Interestingly enough, the whole principle behind the Walter and Electra boats was pretty much speed is our armour, because of course submarines are very difficult to armour generally, but if they could achieve high teens, low 20s of knots underwater, then they could outrun some escorts and outrun meaningful resistance by any escort, because if you were running at 18, 20, 25 knots underwater, depending on the exact submarine and the design, then it would be near enough impossible for an escort, even if it was a faster one that could physically keep up with you, to keep an ASDIC lock on you or drop reliable depth charges on you. And flipping that on its head, a lot of converted ocean liners used the principle of speed will be our protection to evade U-boat attacks, simply by just powering through the seas so quickly that even if a U-boat spotted them on the horizon, there was basically zero chance of that U-boat getting into an intercept position in time. Alfred Wilmore asks, could you recommend some books or other resources on seaplane tenders and their operations in both the world wars? I'd be especially interested in works that cover the seaplane squadron of Russia's Black Sea Fleet in the Great War. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, no one has written any specific books to any great extent about seaplane tenders. About the only one I know of is Eyes of the Fleet, which is about the US Navy seaplane tenders in World War II. Other than that, you're basically down to the relevant editions of Conway's All the World's Warships and the bigger and better books about aircraft carrier development in the respective navies. Norman Friedman's British Carrier Aviation, for example, actually covers British seaplane tenders in a lot of detail, and so on and so forth for American and Japanese fleets, because obviously they have carrier forces, so as I said, the bigger and better references for them will tend to incorporate the seaplane tenders as part of the overall history of naval aviation. There are also specific articles about specific ships in things like Warship and Warship International. If you happen to know a specific vessel, then you can look that up. And I have pretty much every copy of Warship and Warship International that is available outside of a handful of Warship International ones. So if you know a specific article, I could always look that up for you. The other one, which I think for your interests might be the closest to an easily accessible book with additional information, would be the book Before the Aircraft Carrier Development of Aviation Vessels 1849 to 1922. Now, I have that, and I know it does cover the Russian ones to a certain degree, and it does have some relatively decent bibliography, so that might point you in the direction of slightly more esoteric sources on that particular subject. But I suspect, as is the case with a lot of stuff, the more and more you dive into it, that you're going to find that something that's a relatively niche subject, like seaplane carriers, in Russia in World War I is likely to still have most of its resources still in Russian. So, for example, looking at the bibliography of Before the Aircraft Carrier, it looks like I'm pretty much right, because the sources that it references you to have a further look at for the Russian stuff are Die Russische Flotte im Ersten Weltkrieg by J.F. Lehmanns, published in Munich in 1970, with also René Greger, which is obviously in German. And apologies to anyone who speaks Russian at this point, because there's another 2-volume work by N.B. Pavlovich called Flot v Pervoi Mirovoi Vojne, published by the Russian Ministry of Defense in Moscow in 1964, which is very obviously in Russian. Library of Context asks, When did the US Navy's perception of the Royal Navy stop being adversarial and switch to a more amicable view? I think personally that it oscillated back and forth quite a lot during the period the channel covers, and potentially I'd argue that it never actually settled into a purely amicable view at the highest levels until well into the Cold War. Now, that's slightly different from the general, the men of the respective navies and to a certain extent their senior officers. I think for them, having a mostly amicable view of the Royal Navy probably bedded in kind of mid-World War One, with obviously the arrival of things like 6th Battle Squadron and so forth, and in some areas was a bit earlier. But on the highest level, and obviously to a certain degree in the rest of the fleet, there's obviously been a huge swing back and forth for obvious national interest reasons as to whether the Royal Navy is a good or bad thing from a US Navy perspective. So, going right from the start, really quickfire, Revolutionary War. Obviously, the Royal Navy is an adversary. But then you have the quasi-war with France, in which case the Royal Navy is a good thing. And then you have the War of 1812, and it's a bad thing again. Then you have this kind of indeterminate period between the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the American Civil War. And at that point, the Royal Navy is largely seen as a good thing because they're kind of making everybody else back off of American interests, because it's also in the British interest, not so much to benefit America, but it's in British interest for nobody else to harass and take over bits of America. Then you have the American Civil War, and of course, whether the Royal Navy is a good or a bad thing depends on which side of the Civil War you're on. And then there's the whole Trent affair, which potentially might have inverted that. Then, post the American Civil War, there's a short period in which some of the higher-ups in US politics and the US Navy seem to think that they can now fight the Royal Navy. That's disabused quite quickly, and you go into a period in the latter part of the 19th century where the Royal Navy is this kind of annoying, omnipresent global force which some claim is restricting America from fulfilling its destiny, but in others, they think, as a furtherance to the earlier part of the 19th century, the Royal Navy is again kind of enforcing the Monroe Doctrine, not on the US Navy's behalf, but again because it suits the Royal Navy, so that's good. But then you have the whole Samoa incident, when the Royal Navy is bad again. Then you have the Dreadnought race, where the Royal Navy is sort of maybe good, but parts of the US Navy would like to be in the Royal Navy's place. And then you have World War One, and for a while there's a, will America stay neutral? Will it join Germany? Will it join the UK? But then it joins in with the UK and France, and therefore now the Royal Navy is good again. Then in the interwar period, generally speaking, after the Washington Naval Treaty, the Royal Navy is seen as not bad. Most of the Navy probably views the British as decent enough allies or near allies, but there are still a number of fleet problems, etc., which you envisage fighting the Royal Navy. And in the 5 years or so between the end of World War One and the final termination of the construction of the post-World War One capital ships, there certainly was quite a bit of tension between the US and Royal Navies. Then obviously going into World War II, they're cooperating, and then after Pearl Harbor they're allies, so the Royal Navy is good again. But then when you get towards the end of World War II, again amongst the higher-ups, particularly people like King and so forth, there's this perception that the Royal Navy is a tool to re-establish the British Empire. Shockingly, it's working in Britain's interests, but now from a political perspective, America wants to completely displace the British Empire as top dog, so therefore it's not in America's interests to have the Royal Navy be too powerful, and therefore, although the US Navy, again, at a grassroots level, was probably quite fond of the Royal Navy at that point, having fought together, from a higher-up and political perspective, the Royal Navy is now a bad thing. And then the Soviets become a major threat, and suddenly the Royal Navy is a good thing again because it helps them counter the Soviet threat. But then the British try to assert some form of, it's not even dominance at that point, but some form of self-interest with the Suez Canal issue. but that happens in an election year, and you can't possibly have anything compromising the re-election chances of the incumbent president, so suddenly the Royal Navy is bad again, and there's almost a shooting in war going on. Doesn't quite get that far, obviously, but there were at least threats that way. So you could argue at that point the US Navy is looking at the Royal Navy as a potential adversary, which is bad, and then it switches back to being a good thing again once that's all over. Excelsior 1 asks, during any of the Royal Navy's refits during World War II, did they say, hey, maybe the blokes across the pond are onto something with that transom stern, and look at it during refits? Would it work with the hull forms that they had, and with the props, shafts, and rudders not make it doable, perhaps? Or the hull form is not wide enough to adapt? The British certainly did adopt the transom stern in a number of their newer ships. For example, you can see here a Hunt-class destroyer. This is the Derwent, I believe, and it has a transom stern. Obviously, HMS Vanguard had a transom stern. But as compared to the cruiser stern, which is the more traditional, slightly pointier one, there are advantages and disadvantages of both types. So transom sterns, generally speaking, have advantages when moving at speed and obviously for weight saving, but are slightly less useful than cruiser sterns if you're maneuvering at lower speeds, say if you have a low cruising speed. So depending on your mission profile will depend on your choice of stern. Also, whether you can come to things like anti-submarine warships, there are minor other advantages, like the fact a transom stern allows you to have relatively easy rail drop-off for depth charges, although you can also obviously adapt that into a more traditional cruiser stern style. But in terms of refitting existing ships, that's a lot more difficult because you would have to completely change the hull lines to take advantage of transom stern effects, and you'd be losing space that you are actually using by chopping off the end of a cruiser stern. So converting a cruiser stern vessel into a transom stern vessel, even during a refit, while theoretically possible, would involve a huge amount of work, essentially rebuilding the entire aft quarter of the ship with new hull lines and so forth, and therefore isn't really practical. The benefits you're going to get compared to the expense is not really worth it. But it is worth incorporating into newer ships if your mission profile calls for it. Telemonian Dan asks, could you give us a brief introduction to the weather war of World War II? How important from a strictly naval standpoint was accurate weather forecasting in the time period that the channel covers, and what measures did different navies take to secure that accurate forecasting? The weather war was largely a product of the North Atlantic, North Sea and Arctic Ocean areas of World War II, although it did have ancillary theatres in the Pacific and so forth, but those somewhat less so than the viciousness in the Atlantic, mostly just because of the sheer distance involved. And what this amounted to, and this kind of answers the second part as well, is that accurate weather forecasting was hugely important for multiple reasons. Knowing when and where storms were going to be would be important in things like rerouting convoys, because big, heavily laden merchant ships didn't necessarily want to run into really heavy storms. And equally, if you were going to be mounting air attacks, cross-channel invasions, or naval operations in general, and equally the Pacific, if you were going to try and conduct carrier strikes on Japan, for instance, knowing what the weather was going to be for the next little while was an incredibly important thing to understand, because it might affect whether you could conduct operations at all, whether they might be more dangerous, or whether there might be benefits. Trying to make a passage through an area where you might expect enemy recon and attack during a heavy storm might actually be something that you want to do, because submarine is going to find it very difficult to spot you and even more difficult to attack in a heavy storm, and aircraft are very unlikely to be operational during that period, so you might use it as cover. But at the same time, you don't want to plan your major invasion at a time when a hurricane or a typhoon is blowing up. And equally, you don't want to fly your recon aircraft into a major storm and lose them, so you need to know what the weather is going to do. Now, for the Allies, it was a little bit easier because obviously with the occupation of Iceland and the physical presence of the UK and the US on opposite sides of the Atlantic, plus various assets they had in the middle of the Atlantic, eventually access to the Azores and so forth, plus all the ships going back and forth and all the aircraft going back and forth. They had quite a good overall impression of what weather was doing, both on either side of the Atlantic and as the weather systems crossed the Atlantic. Germany was in a slightly worse position in that it didn't have any of that, and U-boats weren't really going to be sticking around on the surface during the day going, yes, we will conduct hours upon hours upon hours of weather observations. So they had to rely on concealed weather ships and trying to sneak land-based stations into remote locations and so forth. And of course, because of the strategic advantages of knowing what the weather is, both sides were very happy to take out the other side's weather stations on land, sink their weather reporting ships at sea, shoot down weather recon aircraft and so forth. Generally speaking, simply because of the preponderance of assets, the Allies got the better of it, but there were interesting raids and counter-raids on remote islands to take out or take over various weather stations and such like. Real MCB asks, during the period that the channel covers, were there any instances of a nation using a ship built by another nation that they had bought, captured, or otherwise obtained to sink a ship built by the original builders of the ship, preferably while that was in service to that original building nation? Yeah, there's a bit of a long list of ships that this covers in the Age of Sail. Several dozen French, Spanish, and Dutch ships of the line, let alone the numerous smaller vessels, all serving under the Royal Navy's flag and then used against their respective navies. Of those, there are a few particular standouts. The Tonnant, captured at the Battle of the Nile, did excellent service in bringing considerably more French ships under the British flag later on. Then you have some other ships you might have heard of. The Belle Isle, very famously fought extremely hard at Trafalgar on the British side. She was actually an ex-French ship, the Formidable, that had been captured in 1795. The Spartiate, also at Trafalgar, also captured a ship, formerly the French Spartiate, and it kind of goes on. Of course, the CSS Virginia was originally the USS Merrimack, then refitted by the Confederacy and then used to sink the USS Cumberland. But usually, outside of very prolonged wars where turnaround of ships could be pretty quick, like the Age of Sail, or very close and again prolonged conflicts like the American Civil War, usually a captured ship was not used against the enemy, partly because it could take a while to refit the thing, and partly because obviously it still looks like an enemy ship, so there's a good chance your own side might attack it by accident. And occasionally you would see an enemy ship put back into service, like with the USS Stuart in World War II being sunk and recommissioned by the Japanese, but in that case you didn't actually run into any US ships to directly attack in her time in service with the Imperial Japanese Navy. Captain Oblivious asks, here's a fun one. If you're about to launch the biggest, baddest warship to ever sail the seas, what would you name it? But with the one rule that it can't be a name that's ever been used before to the best of your knowledge. Well, there's the obvious one to go for with, which is Thunderchild, because that has not actually been used in real life. It's only ever been used in War of the Worlds and would make an awesome name for a really big ship. Now, of course, you could go into poetic names, which have been used in all sorts of media, everything from the Halo franchise to the Culture series and so forth. But that would be, I think, cheating a little bit. But the problem is, with any single word, pretty much every decent one has been taken, including some of the more esoteric mythical ones. At which point, although it in and of itself would be a little bit of a reach because people would need to understand what you were on about to be in fear of it, I'd probably go with calling it the Teakle from The Writing on the Wall, Meeny, Teakle and a Parson, because the interpretation of Teakle is that you've been weighed in the balance and found wanting, which, if you understand the reference, is not exactly something you want to see coming towards you as an announcement. Edward Olsen asks, in your torpedo comparison video, you mentioned an Italian anti-convoy torpedo. Can you elaborate on how it swam around the convoy? Did it have a special gyro that constantly changed the rudder to form a spiral path, or did it have a way to switch from turning to straight to turning again? So it's a little bit difficult to piece together because there is a lot of conflicting information as to exactly how it worked. But from what I've been able to piece together, it was an electric torpedo that was dropped into the water by parachute. And then, at least according to a number of Italian sources, which, being an Italian weapon, I would think maybe have a little bit more of a handle on how it actually worked, it seems to have worked by motoring ahead in a straight line for a short period of time, a little bit like a conventional torpedo, at which point it switched to doing an increasing series of arcs, and then at the end of that, it seems to have just gone into a general spiral turn. So given its nature, I suspect that was probably some form of timer. So, a very simple set of instructions. Initially, motor goes forward, rudder is central, and then much like the gyros on conventional torpedoes that could be adjusted when a timer ran down to change direction, with a series of time steps, you could just go, okay, switch left, now switch right, wait a bit longer, switch left again. That gives you your initial sweeping arcs, and then the final instruction would just be, okay, rudder over to whatever, and that would start it doing its big spiral. They were obviously, ideally, designed to hit a ship and obviously cover a much wider area than a torpedo that just ran in a straight line, but they also had a very important effect in disrupting formations, because unlike a conventional torpedo, which it came past, and if it missed, and that was it, you could pretty much ignore it. With this thing, if it came past and missed you, well, it could be back a few minutes later, and it might be heading off in the direction of another ship, and because it's constantly changing course, it makes evasion more difficult, and it means you just want to generally not be in the general vicinity of it. And if the convoy is forced to break up its formation a bit to avoid a whole bunch of these dropped in front of it, although it in and of itself might not do a huge amount of damage, by breaking up the convoy's formation it makes it much easier for other attacks to then be successful against the convoy ships. The almighty Hypnotoad asks, how exactly were ships' crests and mottos chosen, especially when the vessel wasn't named after a notable person? Unfortunately, it's an extremely haphazard process throughout history, and the answer, much as I like saying the answer varies widely depending on which navy you're in, it really does in this case. Which navies use mottos and ships' crests or coats of arms, whatever you want to call them, and which don't, and when they introduce them officially versus unofficially, when they use them at all, if they use them at all. It's one of the widest ranges in all of naval history. It might surprise you to know that, in actual fact, the official systemization of Royal Navy ships' crests and mottos wasn't actually fully integrated into the Navy until pretty much the Second World War, although it had been picking up steam since the mid to late 1800s. And before that, it had mostly been a private affair for individual ships and their captains. And so there was a mixture of, well, this is officially what has been decided for this ship, presumably because the name hasn't been used before, or no ship before had anything identifiable with it. So that would be done by bureaucracy and committee, whereas other ships had very long histories and had pre-existing heraldry that they might have used and pre-existing mottos, and those would be adopted and in some cases adapted if it wasn't thought that it was suitable or would fit on the current way that things were displayed. And at some points, the ship's motto in some navies is chosen by the first commanding officer, and in other cases, as I said, is approved by a central committee. And so you can get a whole weird range of things. So some are relatively obvious and easy to decode. HMS Woolwich, for example, has its crest as being a cannon with a lion, because Woolwich Arsenal, that's where lots of guns were made. But, HMS Ulster having its crest primarily containing a red hand dripping blood, but indicating kind of stop, that requires a lot more esoteric knowledge of why that's relevant to Ulster. Whereas there's some really, really basic ones as well, like HMS Harrier. It's a dog, actually, not a bird of prey, but a harrying dog. At one point, HMS Leopard just literally has a leopard. but sometimes it might be inspired by coats of arms of a famous individual who perhaps the ship is named for, or who captained the ship in the past, or battles the ship fought in, or plays on words. HMS Acute has a picture of a drawn sword because a drawn sword has a acute edge. The Regent has a crown and a red dragon, which might not seem immediately apparent, but of course red dragon is the symbol of Wales, and the Prince of Wales is the next in line to the throne, so therefore if the throne required a regent, the Prince of Wales would be the logical choice, therefore the Welsh dragon is used as that symbol. And then you have some of the more esoteric ones, like why does HMS Hood have a chough, the national bird of Cornwall, as its symbol? Because Hood was not associated with Cornwall, and the person she was named for, Sir Samuel Hood, was also not associated with Cornwall. He was associated, to be fair, with Dorset and Somerset, which are near Cornwall, but are not in fact Cornwall. But it actually goes back to Sir Samuel Hood, one of many Admiral Hoods back in the Age of Sail, because his particular crest above his coat of arms had a chough at the top of it. So it's an element of the crest of the coat of arms of one of the Admiral's Hood, particularly in this case Samuel Hood, 1762 to 1814, which is then adopted as the main part of the ship's badge for HMS Hood, the battle cruiser in the 1910s, 1920s and 1930s. Yeah, it can get really weird. Not Shaped for Sportive Tricks asks, Hi Drac, I've long been puzzled about how ammunition was supplied to secondary casemate batteries in dreadnoughts and cruisers. Did each gun have its own shell hoist, or was there a single hoist that brought up ammunition for the entire battery, which was then distributed in handcarts or similar? In almost all cases, the following approach was used. Because casemate batteries tended to run along the length of the ship in the amidships portion of the vessel, there was no way you could have separate magazines and hoists for all of them, because you'd have magazines down in the machinery spaces or the coal bunkers or the fuel tanks, which obviously isn't really going to work. In some later ships with turreted or external mounted secondaries, they might have magazines in these areas, but somewhat higher up in the ship, but we're talking about casemate batteries. So for casemate batteries, normally you would have the 4, 5, 6 inch, whatever caliber magazines with the main gun magazines. So normally, obviously, that would be fore and aft, with some exceptions where you have amidships turrets. And these magazines would usually be slightly further towards the center of the ship. So ahead of the aft main magazines, aft of the forward main magazines. And that allows you to group all your magazines together in one approximate location. There would then be hoists which would take the shells and, if necessary, charges up from these to the casemate deck level, but then once they got to the casemate deck level, they would have to be distributed down the length of the casemate. So, of course, there would be some ready-use ammunition with the casemates, but how exactly those were distributed down the casemates depends greatly on the ship, the navy, the time period. For some, there was a conveyor belt system. For others, there was an overhead rail system which you could attach them to and run them down, or it might be motorized or otherwise automated. And in some older ships, it would literally just be a case of people standing there at the hoists receiving the ammunition and then having to physically just carry it to the guns in question. And obviously, how much automation, how much machinery, the later on you get, the more likely that is. And also, obviously, as casemate guns increase in size, it becomes more and more necessary to have mechanical assistance. You may have very occasional differences in this. As I said, if you have an amidships turret, a Q turret in Royal Navy parlance, you might have a magazine near there. Or if you have only a very, very few casement-mounted guns, like, say, on a Scharnhorst-class armoured cruiser, there might be some slight changes there. But broadly speaking, 95% of ships with casement batteries, this is the approach that they would take. Eric Van Dooting asks, if Japan had signed the Second London Naval Treaty, what alternative doctrines do you think they might have pursued instead of the outranging strategy that they did with the Yamatos, which wouldn't really be possible with the displacement and gun size restricted to the same levels as everybody else? what might a treaty-compliant capital ship design have looked like to achieve this alternate doctrine? Well, I think it's difficult to predict because, of course, historically they went with Yamato, and they started going with Yamato even before the Second London Naval Conference was on. But I think if they were somehow to be persuaded to go with sticking to 35,000 tons and 16-inch guns, we can probably look at the Congo-class replacements they were planning to build in the early 1930s as kind of a rough idea of where they probably would have gone with it. So, massively compact citadel, shortened at every possible opportunity to pack maximum armour in, resulting in a citadel that is, actually far too small to keep the ship afloat if the ends are riddled, but it'll keep the magazines and the machinery intact just about. And then compacting as many heavy guns in there as possible. As you can see in this particular variant, you've got 10 16-inch guns in 2 quad turrets and a twin, and I suspect they may have continued along that vein. So, I mean, as much as it would be tempting to say, well, look, if you lose the twin, you've still got 8 guns and you can compact down even more and get more speed, they really, really want the firepower. So I think, if anything, they would have used the sort of half-decade of naval advancements that they would have had, technologically speaking, to maybe try and compact this down even further, maybe have an integrated mast and funnel setup and superstructure setup, a bit like the French did with the Richelieus, to save even more amidship space, and maybe see if they can squeeze another quad in, i.e. upgrade that forward twin to a quad, and if necessary lie a little bit about the displacement overall. But, with various advances in machinery and hull design, they might just have pulled it off. Duke Master asks, another Master and Commander question, since you seem to like these. I really do. I love the film. At the film's beginning, Surprise is at what seems to be a shift change time early in the morning, with most of the crew still asleep. After Acheron opens fire on them and all doubt of sighting is removed, Captain Aubrey gives the order to run up the colours, which tells me they were running without colours prior to being fired upon. Granted, Acheron did apparently correctly identify them as a frigate rather than a merchant, given the full broadside they unleashed from the fog, so it wasn't as though misidentification took place, but there could be an accusation of Surprise not adhering to the rules of war. I could imagine an irritated or ruthless Acheron captain instead treating Surprise's crew as either pirates or spies, given they only hoisted colours after the fight started. Britain was openly at war during the setting, so perhaps the rules of display of colours were different in that era. Would a warship be running without colours during the daytime, even during war? Yes, the rules were very different back then. These days, of course, the Royal Navy, through the 20th century as well, has the tradition of when war is declared, the white ensign goes up and it stays there until the end of the war. And I'm fairly sure some other nations have similar traditions. However, back in the age of sail, you were not obligated to display your colours at all times, or at all, really, apart from if you're undertaking hostile action. So you see in the War of 1812, for example, in numerous cases which would eventually lead to conflict between American and British ships, the first stages of that conflict were the two parties edging in closer to each other, trying to identify each other, and very often requesting the other side to identify themselves by hoisting their colours, even during the day, which obviously indicates that neither side was actually flying their colours in an attempt to deceive people who might be looking at them. Also, there is a small practical point, which is that in the age of sail, ships could be at sea for months, if not years, and flags will wear out in the wind. And so if you're potentially going to be out at sea for months and possibly on station for years, you only have a limited supply of flags, so you don't necessarily want to be flying your flag all the time, because otherwise you'd run out of flags very quickly. Now, that aside, there is something else, because of course there is the colours hoisting ceremony. Now, you may be arguing, well, they should have had colours hoisted then, but in the film they've actually covered their bases on both grounds. Firstly, of course, Surprise was not in action or attempting to be in action when she was engaged, so she wasn't obligated by the rules of war at that point to have her colours hoisted. But also, you'll notice that Captain Aubrey, when he gives the order to hoist the colours, he also orders them to make a note in the ship's log saying that they've engaged an enemy frigate at 6 bells. And as you mentioned, the setting tells us this is the morning, people are just waking up, So if we look at the chart of bells, the morning watch, which is the one that's appropriate for this, 6 bells equates to 7 o'clock, and hoisting colours is supposed to take place at 8 o'clock if you are hoisting colours. So therefore, in both circumstances, Surprise is not supposed to have her colours running at this point. Of course, she has been engaged in action and she's intending to fire back, so she hoists her colours to identify herself so that the combat takes place honourably. But once again, Master and Commander has gotten the details exactly right. Explicitly Implicit asks, a common narrative or fact about World War II is that the Axis severely underestimated American production capacity in World War II. But is this really true, and if so, how severely did they underestimate said capacity? It's kind of a yes and no. It depends quite a lot actually on what part of the Axis you're talking about. The Italians, to be perfectly honest, didn't really care about American production capacity because they never planned to be at war with the Americans, which leaves you with the Japanese and the Germans. Now, the Japanese knew absolutely that the Americans could outproduce them. To exactly what extent was not necessarily clear, but they didn't really care at that point, because being severely outproduced is being severely outproduced. It doesn't really make too much odds if they outproduce you by a factor of 5, 10, or 15. It's not a winnable situation. And that had been impressed on them by various officers like Yamato, who they'd sent over to America during the interwar period. Their entire plan hinged on that they could get the Americans to come to terms before the American production machine could spin up. And so therefore that leaves the Germans. The Germans also as a whole weren't necessarily planning on being at war with America, and they certainly weren't planning on being at war with America in 1941. But I think if anyone was making the largest miscalculation of American production capacity, it probably was the Germans. And I think that was influenced by 2 major factors. Firstly, of course, they came into the war when Japan had just bombed Pearl Harbor, so they were thinking that any American production capacity that did exist would be split between fighting Japan and the entirety of the Western Pacific, and fighting in Europe, and fighting most of Europe. And logically, the thinking went that, well, we know what our production capabilities are now compared to pre-war, and even if we scale American production capabilities up by that much, it's still going to stretch them somewhat to fight the entirety of the Japanese Empire and a Nazi-dominated Europe. Of course, that was forgetting that American industry wasn't subject to the bombings and so forth that European industry was, and also forgetting that the Germans were trying to integrate various industries from multiple different countries, most of which were not particularly willing to be part of the Nazi war machine, whereas in America it was just a case of, okay, we just build more factories and resource extraction facilities. You're not having to worry about whether the fact that Texas resents Washington or Arizona resents California or Virginia resents Maine any more than they did before the war. And I think another factor, which may have played into at least some German officers' thinking, was the experience of World War I. Because in World War I, when American troops, etc., showed up to fight on the Western Front, although they came very often with their own small arms, rifles and so forth, the vast majority of that early American expeditionary force, when it came to larger stuff, machine guns, artillery, tanks, and aircraft, were using quite a bit of equipment that was supplied to them by the British and the French. Now, to be fair, at that point, American war industry wasn't capable of ramping up immediately to meet the demands of the massively growing American armed forces, because prior to World War I, frankly, the American army had been a little bit of a sad joke, numbers-wise. The US Navy, as we've covered many times before, was basically building almost exclusively capital ships, because that was all their budget could stretch to, and what would later become the US Army Air Force, it was basically outnumbered by privately owned aircraft by US officers. And I think perhaps some German planners were influenced by that impression and maybe got the idea that, yeah, the Americans can supply large amounts of manpower, but maybe can't supply the complex industry of war. Of course, anyone who'd been paying attention to what the Americans had built up in the latter stages of the 1910s and had gone on to build in the interwar period would have been somewhat violently disabused of that notion, but not everybody was paying that much attention to those kinds of things. So, as I say, I think it depends very much on which nations you're looking at, and even then which people in those particular nations. But as an overall broad categorization, if you take the Axis as a whole, especially the bits of the Axis the Americans were fighting most significantly, they certainly hadn't misunderstood that the Americans could outproduce them, but to varying levels they had perhaps misunderstood to quite what scale that could be ramped up. Mark Roman asks, in the Dreadnought to Iowa era, how were the powder charge weights set? Was it a failure point minus a safety factor, to achieve a desired range, to achieve a desired spread, to maximise barrel life, or some other factor? Or to put it another way, why do the Iowas use specifically 610-pound bags and not 605-pound bags or 115-pound bags? It's a mixture of factors. So you would have initially a target range and desired capability of armour penetration at specific battle ranges. From that, and the armour-piercing shell that you were going to use in the gun, you would derive how fast that shell needed to be at specific points along the line. And from that, you would work back and calculate, well, how much muzzle energy does this shell need? If you now know the muzzle energy, and you know the weight and mass of the shell, you can then calculate for how much energy actually needs to be released by the propellant, and from that you can work out how large a breech chamber you need, and from the volume of the propellant you can work out how much mass the propellant's going to weigh, and from that you can then split it into however many sections you need for it to still be relatively man-portable. That's a very simplistic explanation of it, and on top of that you would have things like, okay, well, we want a safety factor, so you would have the standard charge, then you would have the maximum rated charge, then you would have the maximum theoretically possible charge where there's a 50-50 chance of the whole thing going boom. And depending on the Navy and depending on the design goals, you might either adapt and build your gun up to that. So let's say you wanted to design a gun that flung a 12-inch shell with the capability to penetrate 12 inches of armour at 12,000 yards, because we're using a lot of 12s. You might then go, okay, well, then we have to build a 12-inch gun this heavy to safely and repeatedly fire a shell that can do that. Or you might go, well, another way of doing it would be, this is the biggest and best gun we can manufacture at this point, and based on scaling factors, rule of thumb, and general experience plus a little bit of calculation, we reckon, we're building now a 13.5-inch gun, which is going to be bigger than a 12-inch gun, which will have about this amount of chamber space, which can fit this much explosive, and then apply safety factor, so the charge is now this much explosive, and that can fire a shell that will do this, and then we can market it and say, well, this is what our gun is capable of. There are a few other approaches, but those are the two primary approaches that you'll see. And the first approach would be more often adopted by a Navy looking for specific performance, saying, okay, I want you to design a gun to do this. And the other approach would be more closely adopted by gun manufacturers, especially in the First World War, who would just be manufacturing and developing guns of their own and offering them for sale to the Navy, or multiple navies if you're Vickers Armstrong. And typically, yeah, you'd be looking for a decent barrel life, 300 rounds per barrel, give or take a little bit, but that would sometimes be sacrificed. If you want a particularly long-range, high-velocity weapon, you'll be prepared to accept a lower barrel life if other considerations, like with the Italian Navy not really having to go all that far, relatively speaking, from their bases, could mitigate those issues. A lot of the time, in terms of spread, that was something that you tended to have to work out after the fact, unfortunately. Dr. D.M. Platt asks, during World War II, the Germans and the British, as well as the Italians, the Japanese, and the Russians, obtained operational control of ships from occupied nations. However, The terms of control and the nature of manning were quite different. Did the British or the Germans make better use of such acquired ships? I think, generally speaking, the British made slightly better use of them, but I think that's also a element of how cooperative the various crews were, because for most of the, ex-Polish, ex-French, ex-Danish, ex-Norwegian, and later on ex-Italian ships that the Germans acquired, pretty much all those nations had pretty strong motivations to try and make sure the Germans didn't get their hands on the vast majority of their shipping. So the stuff that the Germans tended to get was a little bit few and far between, scattered amongst various classes, usually quite small. And of course, they were trying to bring those ships in to the Kriegsmarine, manned by German crews, doing Kriegsmarine missions, etc. And I think that made the whole thing considerably more difficult, because then you had mostly at that point German light forces, destroyers and down, which were operating a huge variety of different ships, all with different performance capabilities, all with different maintenance requirements, spare parts requirements, and you're asking German crews to learn how to maintain and operate a multiplicity of ships with a multiplicity of different operating procedures, etc. Whereas, generally speaking, most of the stuff that the British tended to get their hands on, destroyers, cruisers, submarines, the occasional battleship, tended to be because the navies in question wanted to continue the fight and wanted to bring their ships over to the UK, at which point they're going to be in much better condition than something that's been intentionally scuttled in the first place. And of course, the operational knowledge of their crews comes with them, and often so the crews themselves as well. And so integrating them into the Royal Navy is much easier. Now, of course, occasionally you will see things like gun batteries and so forth being replaced with Royal Navy models to standardize the production and supply of ammunition and things. But broadly speaking, if you have, let's say, a small Polish patrol craft that's been fished up out of a harbour, put back together and stuck into German service, you're asking a German crewman to understand how a Polish ship works with Polish spare parts, which you've then got to find the suppliers for and assume that the suppliers are going to supply you, and under duress they might, but they might not give you all those parts the fine care and attention they need, so you might find they break down quite often, and of course it's going to be somewhat different from what the German crew are used to anyway, so they're going to take a while to learn how to get everything working, whereas when this Gehres shows up, it's got a Polish crew on it, they're very happy and very motivated to keep it working and maintained, they're very happy to share all the knowledge that they have that's necessary to get spare parts made to keep everything running. They're very motivated to keep the ship going and fighting on the high seas. They'll very, very happily sail out and fight Germans for you. So it's just a much, much easier task for everybody concerned. And therefore, because of that core motivation of why are these ships in service, the British are able to make much better use of the ships, apart from the fact, obviously, they're generally far more capable, because destroyers, cruisers, battleships, and submarines are a lot more useful than a handful of small patrol craft. And with the free navies, of course, you know, if anything, you're going to have problems holding them back from going after their opponents, rather than trying to nurse the thing out into combat in incredibly uneven circumstances. The Hand of Ray asks, what if the Illustriouses and Implacables had gone with American-style tall open hangar bays, cutting down and reducing side armour while retaining or even strengthening the flight deck armour with saved weight? Do you think they would have lasted longer post-war instead of just being essentially rendered obsolete with the entrance of the jet age? They absolutely would have lasted longer, and they would have looked incredibly different. Sometimes people underestimate just how much protection was built into the British armoured carriers. So, for example, the Essex class is commonly listed as having a total weight devoted to protection of just under 1,000 tons, whereas if you look at British Carrier Aviation by Norman Friedman, he lists the Illustrious class as having about 5,000 tons devoted to protection, and even notes in a footnote that only includes half the weight of the flight deck, because at least some of that steel would be necessary for structural purposes anyway. So, yeah. Quite a bit. I mean, so if you compare the Illustriouses to, say, Yorktown, what you're actually looking at with an Illustrious compared to a Yorktown is actually a hull that at its core would probably displace 1,000 to 2,000 tons less than a Yorktown, with all the commensurate impacts on size and capacity, etc., and then with 5,000 tons of armour slapped onto it. And I mean, you look at Ark Royal. Ark Royal displaces 1,000 tons standard less than an Illustrious class, but has almost double the aircraft capacity, depending on whether you're looking at design or actual, despite weighing less. And it's still got, a reasonable amount of armour. Ark Royal has a 4.5-inch belt in common with the Illustriouses. It's just it doesn't have all that armoured hangar sides, as well as obviously the armoured flight deck and so forth. Now, if you'd gone with an approach of having no armoured hangar sides, maybe just splinter and blast proofing and splinter and blast proofing for the belt, so cut out all that 4.5-inch side armour and then just gone with the deck armour, you'd be saving probably 3,500-4,000 tons worth of weight. Now, it might be tempting to stick even more of that on the flight deck, but to be perfectly honest, I think the flight deck thickness of the British armoured carriers was probably enough, because when you see what bombs it actually took to overcome that flight deck strength, maybe an extra half-inch might have helped a little bit against kamikazes and so forth, but if you're going to then say, okay, we want armour flight decks that can reject 2,200-pound armour-piercing bombs from the Luftwaffe, suddenly you're looking at, doubling or more that flight deck thickness, and I think that's a little bit impractical. So maybe a 3.5-4-inch flight deck, fine. That'll use up a little bit of the weight. Of course, you've got a fairly top-heavy ship now because you've taken off all the side armour, or most of it. So you are going to have to make some adjustments to the hull form to maintain stability. But with all that extra weight available, displacement, you can make the hull considerably bigger, which means you can also perhaps make the hangar somewhat larger. And at that point, you might end up with a vessel that can easily carry 60, 70 aircraft while having this very protected flight deck. And in British Pacific Fleet operating conditions, you'd be able to push that up to, 80, 90, 100 plus with the use of deck parking. And in fact, there was an alternate design M, which wasn't even anywhere near as ambitious as what I just described. It still had a degree of side protection against shells, and even that was looking at being able to carry 54 aircraft baseline, because it was looking at less side protection and more just keeping the deck protection. And part of that expanded hull would have obviously been taller hangars, and that was essentially the main sticking point for the Illustriouses and the Implacables. Yeah, sure, the overall hangar space wasn't great, and their overall size wasn't great going forward. The Implacable somewhat less affected by that than the Illustriouses, but the single biggest problem was these relatively short hangars. If you're able to have those be taller, because you're saving a lot of weight taking armour off of the sides, then especially with Indomitable, the last of the Illustriouses, and the two Implacables, which have double hangars as opposed to the other three Illustriouses, then you potentially have a carrier that can carry a very large number of aircraft and has an armoured flight deck while retaining mostly open or splinter and blast-proof sides, which is essentially roughly the kind of armour scheme that would be adopted on the much larger Midway class post-war. So, yeah, while I think maybe Indomitable would have overall been a little bit too small for continuous operations later on, she still would have stuck around, and the Illustrious probably would have stuck around, which would have forced a lot less panic in the early stages about what do we have to do to refit carriers. But the Implacables, I think, probably would have lasted a fairly long time alongside the Audaciouses. Samuel G. Gurley asks, Ralph Seymour is commonly described as an incompetent flag lieutenant, but do you think it's possible that he was competent and has been scapegoated, and instead the problem was Beattie's confusing commands? After all, the current assessment of Seymour was created during Beattie's tenure as First Sea Lord, and we all know that Beattie and his staff tried to shift blame to others away from Beattie. There is definitely blame on both sides, but you have to remember that Yes, although Beatty did throw Seymour under a bus, he threw Seymour under a bus in large part because people were starting to question the competency of the flag signals that they'd been sent and how confusing they were. And ultimately that responsibility does lie to a greater or lesser degree with Seymour, because, for example, some of Beatty's commands do make sense, like in the run to the south when he sees the high seas fleet and tells everyone, okay, we need to turn around and go back. That signal makes sense, but Seymour's execution of it, not hauling it down to signal 5th Battle Squadron to turn around, that is primarily a fault with the flag lieutenant, because even if Beatty didn't explicitly say, okay, I want you to haul the flag down now, part of a flag lieutenant's responsibility is to gauge the intent of his commander and communicate that effectively to the rest of the ships. So if Beatty says, right, we need to get out of here, we need to turn around 180 degrees, go back north, and he's swinging his flagship around, and the battlecruiser fleet is turning around and heading north, even if Beatty hasn't explicitly said, I want you to execute the command via flag, a competent flag lieutenant would go, oh, okay, right, we're doing the turn thing. 5th Battle Squadron is supposed to be sitting at the tail end of the battlecruiser fleet. I need to haul this flag down so that they know, as well as the rest of the battlecruisers, that we're going north. And similarly, it's also a flag lieutenant's job to gently question potentially odd signals. So at the Battle of Dogger Bank, when Beatty is trying to grandstand and engage the enemy more closely and ends up screwing it up and sending everyone after Blucher, the combination of signals that he sends, which makes everyone think he wants them to go after Blucher, Beatty is expressing his intentions. He wants people to close in on the German battlecruisers and finish them off. He then orders a certain set of signals. Seymour just goes, oh, okay, I'll haul those signals up. A competent flag lieutenant would have looked at the situation and gone, hang on a minute, if I haul up this one, the target and the enemy bearing is this way, well, that's pointing at Blucher, and then I tell everyone, right, we want you to engage the enemy ships. That combination is going to make people think we want them to engage Blucher, which isn't what the Admiral has just said he wants to do. So then he would come back and say, okay, Admiral, I understand what you want to do. Perhaps we should hoist this slightly different set of signals that will be more clearly indicative of your intent, at which point, then hopefully those signals will be clearer and the engagement goes better. Much in the same way as like when Nelson initially wants to say, well, depending on which source you use, either Nelson confides or England confides that every man will do his duty. A Seymour-type flag lieutenant will go, yes, sir, of course, I'll get that up immediately, sir, and result in an endless and confusing series of flags, whereas Nelson's competent flag lieutenant said, I'd have to spell out some of those words. Can we use expect instead? Okay, and depending on your source, possibly England instead of Nelson. And Nelson just goes, yeah, okay, that's the general gist of what I want to say gets sent, so fine, let's do that. So while, yes, Beatty expressing himself perhaps a little bit unclearly does hold some water, the simple fact is a competent flag lieutenant would have interpreted those orders properly, or at least raised the issue with Beatty, at which point the fault falls back entirely to Beatty. Yokosuka Girls Marine High School training vessel Harikaze asks, apart from the Germans at the end of World War I and the Japanese with Tengo in World War II, has any other country or navy planned to gather their fleet as much as possible into one place and then do a suicidal charge into the enemy to cause as much damage as possible? Yeah, it's happened a few times. I mean, the Italians in World War II, they were planning on basically taking every ship that they could find enough fuel for and sailing it straight at the Allied landings. They weren't anticipating getting many of them back, but they thought it would do a fair bit of damage and perhaps forestall Allied invasion efforts. And more commonly, there have been various suicidal charges by large portions of a fleet in order to cause a lot of damage and confusion in the enemy fleet, but to perhaps a greater cause than just the damage, to allow perhaps the Admiral or the King or the Queen to escape. So, for example, at the Battle of Actium, a good chunk of Mark Antony and Cleopatra's fleet was sacrificed to allow said Mark Antony and Cleopatra to actually escape the battle. And to a certain extent, you could even argue Admiral Villeneuve's original plan. Since he was coming to be replaced, his attitude was, well, I'm going to sail out and fight and do something rather than just be replaced in disgrace. He then tried to turn around when he saw Nelson's fleet, but still got caught at Trafalgar. Vintage Car History asks, my ship, USS Henry B. Wilson, was alongside the USS Jason for a couple of days while some repairs were being done, and I had a chance to go aboard her in 1989. She had a nickname, the Love Boat, as she was a non-combatant and at the time women could serve aboard. We all knew she was a World War II era ship and the oldest in our home port of San Diego. Could you tell us a bit more about that ship? Well, very briefly, the Jason was one of a 4-strong class of repair ships, the Vulcan class, alongside, obviously, the Vulcan herself, then the Ajax and the Hector, and Jason being the 4th of the class. She was built in the middle of World War II and saw repair action in the latter stages of the war, 44-45. So this is her helping USS Randolph, and as you can see, USS Randolph has a hole in her aft flight deck where a hole should not be as a result of a kamikaze. Now, one thing you'll notice, compared to probably when you saw her, is that given that she had to defend herself against air attacks and so forth, in this photo, Jason has some guns on her. You can see a pair of single mounts there right aft, and a few others scattered around if you look really closely. Now, in this format, she would obviously serve for the end of World War II, and then pretty much remain stuck in the Western Pacific for the better part of the next couple of decades. Decade and a half, I would say, maybe more accurate. Because every so often, they would try and bring her back to San Diego to operate on the West Coast. And then something else would happen. So she was off of the Japanese coast and in and around the area in the immediate post-war period. They brought her back to the US. The Korean War broke out, so back it was over to the Western Pacific to support the ships that had become damaged or needed maintenance because of the Korean War. And then sticking around a little bit after that as forces were wound down. And then they brought her back to the West Coast for a little bit. She popped back and forth. And then the Vietnam War broke out, so then she had to go and support ships that were damaged or needed maintenance because of the Vietnam War. And it was only in the early 1960s that she was able to actually come back to the US for any considerably extended period of time. And it was during that period in the early 60s when she lost her armament, because at that stage, let's face it, a handful of World War II era 5-inch guns on a repair ship are not going to help you against jet bombers and such like. So it was considered better to take them off, saves weight, lets you do other things with her, and renders her specifically, now unarmed, a non-combatant ship. And hence, as you mentioned, in the rules of the mid to late Cold War US Navy, women could now serve aboard her. And then she mostly spent her time doodling up and down the West Coast, occasionally deploying over back to the Western Pacific. She very much was a Pacific ship. Except for right towards the end of the Cold War, when you had the Gulf War kicking off, she ended up going a little bit further afield than normal and supporting Gulf War operations, including a number of US ships that were hit by mines during various exercises and operations in the 1991 Gulf War. And after that, she came back to the US and was then eventually decommissioned and scrapped in the mid-90s. Lord Quack, King of the Ducks, asks, non-Navy navies. The Japanese Army is fairly famous or infamous for having its own aircraft carriers and other ships. We also know the US Navy had a large fleet of supply and transport ships during World War II and to some extent still does. What other nations had significant non-Navy naval shipping, and how were they employed either in coordination with their navies or as standalone asset? I think really you actually picked up on the two navies with the biggest non-Navy naval elements. I mean, the British Army has a handful of ships, mostly landing craft in the time period that the channel covers, but unlike the Japanese Army's Navy, for example, all of the major landing craft are in Britain's control are still part of the Royal Navy. And likewise with the French and the Germans, as far as I'm aware, also the Italians, the Soviets, I mean, even the Soviet river gunboats were technically Soviet naval assets for the most part, even if they did use tank turrets. So I think you'd have to go back considerably further, perhaps to the Age of Sail or medieval times, when perhaps a heavily
land-based power with a not particularly large navy found it necessary to move their troops around, and probably would find it easier, therefore, to have army-controlled transport fleets rather than putting them briefly under the control of a too small navy. But if anyone else knows of a large army navy or air force navy outside of the Japanese and the Americans, please feel free to let us know in the comments below. Rob Smith asks, we hear about naval surface ships capturing submarines, but were there any cases of a submarine capturing a naval surface ship? And as a follow-on, what about a civilian ship capturing a belligerent submarine that was trying to capture them? I'm not aware of any circumstances for either scenario. I think in large part that's going to be because if a submarine manages to hit a naval surface ship enough that it would consider surrendering, considering a submarine's primary armament is torpedoes, because let's face it, a submarine's not going to win a gunfight with anything significant, well, that ship is going to be in a sinking condition, and also the submarine has nowhere near enough crew to put a prize crew aboard something like a warship with so many of its own crew. Conversely, while there were civilian ships that got the better of submarines that were attacking them, it tends to be in the form of either Q ships with armament or merchant ships that rammed a U-boat. Captured U-boats were fairly rare at the best of times, because usually the kind of damage that would induce a submarine to give up fighting was also the kind of damage that would see the submarine sink fairly quickly thereafter. So, as far as I'm aware, there aren't any cases of civilian ships capturing a submarine on the open seas, nor are there any cases of significant warships surrendering to a sub, again, outside of overall orchestrated surrenders at the end of a war. George Robert asks, I ran across a picture of then Captain William Packenham with the captain of the Japanese battleship Asahi during the Russo-Japanese War. This made me wonder, since he was at both the battles of Tsushima and of Jutland, he probably saw quite a few heavy shells fired in anger. Did any other Royal Navy senior officer likely have an opportunity to see more? Packenham might, I think, a record for sheer number of capital ship grade shells fired, but in terms of seeing shells fired in anger, total, I think he might have three main competitors in the Royal Navy. The first one would be Admiral Cunningham, because, of course, Cunningham, well, he wasn't at Jutland, but he was at Gallipoli. There were an awful lot of shells fired during that period. And then, of course, he was in the Mediterranean, taking part in numerous surface actions against the Italian fleet, which cumulatively added up to a lot of shells expended. And then you also have Philip Vian and John Tovey, both of whom were at Jutland, so they saw all of those shells fired. And then, of course, Vian took part in a number of engagements during the Norwegian campaign. He was also present during the attack on Bismarck. He was in charge of the destroyer flotilla that kept them awake the previous night. Then he went off into the Mediterranean, so he was in a number of Cunningham's actions and a number of smaller ones as well, a lot of convoy work. He was also off the D-Day landings off of Normandy, so an awful lot of shells fired there as well. And then he was in the British Pacific Fleet with had a few shore bombardment missions. Tovey, of course, again at Jutland, in the Mediterranean a lot in the early stages of the war, fighting in various actions, including the Battle of the Aspero Convoy, where there were a huge number of shells expended, about 5,000 shells. He was also at the Battle of Calabria. Then, of course, he was also present at the battle that sank the Bismarck, which, yeah, that expended a lot of shells as well. So, in terms of total numerical shells fired, those three probably have good legs on Packenham. Silderin Machine Works asks, HMAS Albatross asked in the previous month's Drydock about scouting planes joining carrier aircraft for an attack, and it got me wondering. I know the scout plane from HMS Warspite bombed a submarine during one of the battles of Narvik. Do you know of any other instances of a ship's scout plane engaging in offensive operations like dogfighting or ground attack? Yeah, this actually happened quite a bit. The AR-196, for example, was known to be used in, obviously, a scouting role by various German surface ships, but also in a limited offensive role. Some AR-196s actually bombed merchant ships to try and get them to stop, and not a few AR-196s ended up in various dogfights. There's multiple reports of various float planes, obviously AR-196s for the Germans, walruses, sea foxes, swordfish for the British, various OSU and OS2U aircraft for the Americans and so forth, all getting involved in attacks on submarines at various points because the light weapons they carried were useful against subs if they could find them on the surface. Observation air, when they were used for gunfire observation, particularly in the Pacific, a number of American scout and spotter planes launched from ships would occasionally go in for strafing or light bombing runs on targets of opportunity. Most of the time they weren't supposed to, but good luck trying to stop them. And as I mentioned, I believe in a previous video, rather famously, a walrus of all things decided it was going to go and end up in a dogfight with a German flying boat at one point on one of the Arctic convoys, which was it was certainly a thing. Jellico Cats asks, inspired by the Lego question in the previous Drydock, I thought I'd take a stab at identifying one of the toys from my childhood, namely the original old-school battleship token from Monopoly. Since Monopoly began life in 1903, I thought it would be a turn-of-the-century battleship. Based on the silhouette, I think it might be BB-4, USS Iowa. Is this close? Close? Not completely on, but you're only one class away. As far as anyone can tell, it seems to be based on USS Indiana, the Indiana-class battleships, which are the ships that immediately precede the Iowa. Now, I can see how you might well think it's Iowa. Obviously, you've got 4.5 turrets, you've got this kind of ascending set of cylinders atop the bridge superstructure, and you have 2 funnels. So, in those respects, yeah, it's very similar to Iowa as well. However, the key difference, I think, which is why the Indiana identification is stronger, also you've got that king post crane at the back, is that if you look at a picture of Iowa, the little raised forecastle beak area is much less prominent on Iowa than it is on Indiana. It's a little bit obscured in this picture comparison because you've got all the men standing around on the bow, but if you look at other pictures of Indiana, you'll see that that forecastle peak is quite prominent, and obviously it is on the token as well. But the main thing is that if you look on Iowa BB4, the main deck level starts at the forecastle, goes along the superstructure, but then drops at the quarterdeck, so the 2 gun turrets are on different levels. Whereas, as you can see here on Indiana, it's a straight through deck, and on the token as well, the hull is straight through, so the 4.5 turrets are on the same level. So pretty close, and superstructure-wise, they are very, very similar, but hull-wise, it's Indiana, not Iowa. Sage of Irrelevance asks, while I was reading Andrew Cunningham's autobiography, I came across the mention of something called X-lighters used in the World War I Gallipoli campaign. They were later used as supply ships in the World War II North African campaign, and they were described as essentially World War I era Higgins boats. What can you tell us about these X-lighters? How were they used, and more importantly, where were they between the world wars? So the X-lighter sits in a rather interesting position in that it's larger than a Higgins boat or an LCA by a considerable margin, but it is a little bit smaller than an LCI, a landing craft infantry. So they're initially designed, built, and entered service all very quickly in 1915. They're 105 foot long. They displace about 160 tons, hence why they're considerably larger than an LCA or a Higgins boat, but smaller than an LCI, which is 200, 250 tons-ish. They're diesel-powered and have about 3.5 foot draft, capable of moving at 7 to 8 knots on a good day, and they can take up to 500 men while only having a crew of 4. Now, quite a few of them were produced in World War I. A few did remain in Royal Navy service, and a few others were requisitioned back into the Royal Navy service in the Second World War, hence their use as supply craft. But their main operational use was in World War I in Gallipoli, but then later on, when a large number of them were sold immediate post-war, they were also saw service in the Baltic campaign against the White Russians, and in Spanish service in one of the endless conflicts with Morocco. And so most of them, though, were sold into civilian service. So there's actually a reasonable number of photos of canals and harbours in the UK with X-lighters wandering around delivering cargo. And here is one of those X-lighters actually delivering a combination of infantry and cargo. They're a mixed construction, so they have a basic steel framework, and then over that you can either put steel sheeting or wooden cladding. Doesn't make much odds particularly. The drop-down ramp, which you can see the men coming off of, is manually operated, and there are a few limitations compared to LCAs or LCIs and Higgins boats in the Second World War. First, as you can see, you have to go up internally, crest over a ramp that lets you leave, and then down the droppable ramp. So unlike some of the later landing craft where you walk out at level straight into the water or onto the beach, this has a bit of a ridge which could expose you somewhat. And as you can probably tell from the men standing on it, although notionally with these covers up you have a degree of cover, you're not massively covered from incoming fire the way some of the higher sided infantry landing craft of the Second World War, even if they didn't necessarily provide you with bulletproof cover, they at least provided you with visual cover against the enemy identifying who was in what. So there are a few drawbacks compared to, well, stuff designed 2 to 3 decades later, but broadly speaking, they're actually a fairly capable unit, and indeed you could say these are probably the first modern amphibious assault craft. But with most of them gone out of service by the Second World War, and of course with this up and over ramp, they're completely unsuitable for vehicle landing operations, even small vehicles. While the idea was a good one, it did need to be developed further for the Second World War. Volunteer per Order O'Sullivan asks, Royal Navy post-war cruiser rebuilds. It had been at least planned in 1947 to rebuild a quantity of the modern cruisers with dual-purpose main batteries. The fleet modernisation section of British Cruisers 2 World Wars and After does go over what could be achieved for all of the Royal Navy's 6-inch classes other than HMS Liverpool and Belfast. It's observed that they offer the greatest potential. However, what could be achieved with this is not stated, only the later, less ambitious but still unaffordable plans. Could you shed any light on the matter? So the reason that Liverpool and Belfast were listed as the town classes with the most potential was that of the surviving town class, they had both the least mileage on their machinery and the greatest reserves of stability. In Belfast's case, that was because, well, she was bigger than the other town class to start with, along with Edinburgh. Obviously, Edinburgh hadn't survived. But then Belfast had been mined, so she'd then been rebuilt, which meant obviously she missed a part of the war, so she didn't have that wear and tear on her machinery. Plus, she had all these extra bulges and so forth put on, so she was a very stable ship. She had the most capacity of all the towns. Liverpool was in a similar boat, although she was a standard-sized town, so she had less reserve than Belfast did, but so did every other town class. But Liverpool had actually been in Drydock for long periods of refit twice after being torpedoed twice in separate incidents, including one where her bow fell off. So she had likewise not had as much mileage put on her by the war, and she had similar amounts of bulging and other stability improvements added to her. Not as much as Belfast, but still there. That's why those two were listed as the ones with the greatest potential for modernisation. Now, in terms of what the modernisation plans were, essentially they were looking at the twin 6-inch automatic turret, the dual-purpose one that would eventually be used on Tiger and Blake and so forth. However, they were looking at trying to modernise the rest of the fleet with them as well. They ruled out the counties, even though theoretically the counties would probably have been best placed to take the turret, because a lot of the counties were just getting very old. The Didos were too small, and they already had 5.25-inch dual-purpose turrets, and that left you with essentially, of the ships that were already in service, because the Swiftsure and what would eventually become the Tigers were still being worked on, it left you with the Fijis, or the Crown Colonies, and the towns. But of course the Fijis had been built to try and fit a town class's worth of armament into 8,000 tons. So although theoretically they were capable of accepting some 6-inch twins, in fact it turned out you could fit pretty much the same amount of guns on a Fiji as you could on what would eventually be HMS Tiger, i.e. 2 twin 6-inch and 3 twin 3-inch dual purpose, which isn't very surprising when you look at the relative size of the hulls, but the Fijis were very tight and constrained ships, so there wouldn't be a lot of space internally, and that led to concerns about shortages of ammunition, because of course these automatic guns could fire very quickly, so you might run out of ammo. The towns, being somewhat bigger, could accommodate these changes more readily and could either retain their existing twin 4-inch or be refitted with twin 3-inch. And at first it was hoped that you could get 3 twin 6-inch in place of their triple 6-inch. And that was because most of the town class and most of the Fijis at that point had already lost the super firing aft turret anyway to make room for more light and medium AA and radar systems and so forth. So you had 3 triple 6 left, so why not replace them with 3 twin 6? And at first it seemed like this might actually be workable in terms of direct weight compromises. However, the need to install even newer, heavier, larger radar, the need to upgrade or replace the anti-aircraft battery, either twin 4s or replace with twin 3s, and the new fire control computers and radar sets for the anti-aircraft system, all of that added additional weight, and then it turned out that the towns as a whole would also be restricted to a pair of twin 6s like Tiger eventually would carry, only they would be able to carry more ammunition and they would be able to generally just accept the upgrades with slightly less compromise elsewhere. Belfast, in theory, might have been able to accept 3 twins because she still had her 4 triple turrets. Liverpool probably still would have gone down to a pair of twins because she was smaller, she'd already lost X turret, she was just in better material condition than the other towns. But a combination of cost and time to do so, plus ever-shrinking budgets, meant that none of this was really implemented, and what would have been a series of upgrades to the more recent and more intact cruisers eventually whittled itself down to just a handful, including Belfast receiving what were called large repairs, i.e. big overhauls, but no changes in their main battery. Sebastian asks, in the movie Battleship Yamato in 2005, there's a scene in the first 5 minutes of the movie which claims the Japanese, or at least Japanese sailors, treat the day of Yamato's sinking as some sort of official holiday with ceremonies, etc., etc. Is this true? I'm not aware of any official kind of Yamato sinking commemoration day in Japan as a whole, certainly. I don't know if the modern Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force commemorates its sinking, although I would suspect as an organisation probably not. Maybe someone who's had closer dealings with the modern Japanese Navy could let me know. And the other problem is, of course, I don't know where I can actually see the 2005 Battleship Yamato movie with English subtitles, which makes looking through the first 5 minutes a little bit difficult because I don't speak Japanese. Conversely, however, from what I did manage to pick up, I think the whole thing is referencing more the fact that it's supposed to be at the time of the film 60 years since the ship sank. So that may have attracted a little bit more ceremony, but even then, the memorial that they show seems to be fairly small and out of the way, and is attended only by a guy who was actually on the ship. So I'm sure some people remember the sinking of the ship every year, but I don't think it's any kind of significant widespread event in Japan. Robert Olweiler asks, can you please give an overview of the development of automatic large caliber, i.e. 3 to 8 inch naval guns? The advantages of them seem so obvious, so why, as I understand it, weren't they given serious development until the 1940s, and why did it take until the 60s for truly reliable automatic systems to become so widespread? What technological hurdles couldn't have been overcome in the 20s or 30s? As far as I've been able to tell, the single greatest problem is what I would describe as extremely fine precision at a macro scale under automatic control. Now, what I mean by that is that you could have very precise instrumentation back then, and you could have even that doing the stuff under automatic control rather than human control. But the limitation was scale. Once you got up to the scale of essentially large caliber artillery, 3-inch, 4-inch, all the way up to obviously 8-inch, the problem was the forces involved and the timings became so precise that the technology of the 20s and 30s just really wasn't up to that level of control. So you could have a system that would very precisely regulate feeding in ammunition and so forth, and controlling the firing cycle of guns, but there would be very slight imprecision to the system. Now, if you're talking about a 20mm or a 40mm, etc., that's not necessarily a problem because, well, a jam is a jam. If you get a jam, it can be cleared by human brute strength, maybe a bit of leverage and hammers involved. And also the forces involved will, if there's a slight degree of imprecision creeping in, kind of compensate for themselves. So, a brass cartridge might deform very slightly without a major effect, that kind of stuff. If it's fed in just a fraction too late or just a fraction too early. But once you get to larger scale issues with, essentially cruiser grade guns, the problem is that either ammunition, especially at 6-inch and 8-inch, might not necessarily exist as single piece ammunition, which is the easiest for an automatic system to feed, because we've got to remember complexity. If you've got a single piece ammunition set, like with a 3-inch gun, that can essentially be loaded very easily. It's a single movement that you've got to worry about. Whereas if you are loading let's say a 2-part piece of ammunition, so a 6-inch shell and a large brass cartridge, then, well, you've got to hope that that cartridge is movable by hand should somebody need to step in if there's a jam, but also you've got to bring the shell up, open the gun, load the shell, and now you've got to repeat almost the entire process to load the ammunition. So you've got to get the whole thing right twice to the same level of precision with two things that are completely different shapes and completely different weights. That's a lot harder to do. You could set up a system which is mechanically fine-tuned to just chuck 3-inch shells downrange into the barrel all day, or into the breech rather. But if you're going to have a system that's going to do that for 6-inch shells and then 6-inch ammunition, and worse still with 8-inch guns, the 8-inch shell, the charge, and then the brass section, potentially, unless you develop a full 8-inch brass charge, at which point, yeah, good luck getting someone to manhandle that if something goes wrong, then you are faced with the problem of either having to massively overcomplicate everything because you're going to have multiple different systems all doing the loading of different components, or you're going to have to come up with some way of adjusting the same loading system repeatedly and accurately time after time, so that when it loads the first thing, it's configured strength-wise, etc., to load and depth-wise to load a shell. Then the second time you load it, it's now loading a charge, and potentially a third time it's loading a cartridge, or it might just be loading a big cartridge. But of course, configuring a system mechanically to do 2 or 3 separate tasks like that with the degree of precision necessary and quickly enough to automatically load a gun, that's actually very difficult. Once you get electronic sensors and measuring devices and just generally advances in fine control technology in the mid to late 40s and then into 50s, now you can start thinking about it at that larger scale. But that's pretty much why you see the automatic 3-inch being the first of the successful types, then the 6-inch, and then the 8-inch, although, as it turns out for the Americans in particular, the 8-inch actually worked better than the 6-inch, but that's just because of the development cycles of those particular weapons. And of course, the other problem is that while you could make a purely mechanical system as described that would do everything theoretically perfectly, again, this is where sensors and very fine precision control comes in, because if you are going to, say, automatically fire a 6-inch gun, that 6-inch gun is going to heat up very quickly, and that's going to slightly change the amount of force you want to be putting in to the ram because things are starting to expand and shift and so forth. And this is where humans are really useful, because a human will intuitively, once they've been trained, understand, okay, this is happening, I need to change what I'm doing, whether that's something they're doing manually or if they're operating a rammer or something, they can slightly change how they do things. An automatic system needs to be able to register that feedback of increasing temperature on the barrel, understand what that means, and make regulated changes. And that's a whole other raft of complexity. And then the whole thing has to survive being elevated, rotated, the shock of the firing, etc., etc. So you might have been able to solve, let's say, 4 out of every 5 problems in the 20s or 30s, but one of them would always come around to bite you. So you could make an extremely precise, extremely adjustable system with plenty of feedback, or just perhaps a regulated set of timings that assumes if you fired X number of rounds in Y number of seconds, therefore you're going to need to adjust your power settings a little bit, and so on and so forth. But that system might be far too delicate to survive the recoil, or at least survive with all its functions operating completely intact. And that is where you start to see the what you might describe as the early computerized controls of the 40s and 50s start to come into play. Cisco Fan asks, after Tsushima, why were Russian prisoners treated so well, but 40 years later Allied prisoners were treated so brutally? Now, I think I've answered either this or a very similar question before in a Drydock, but to reiterate briefly, my personal impression, and of course people who have studied Japanese culture in the early 20th century feel free to chime in with more in-depth analysis, but my personal impression is that it was a twofold aspect or element. And in some ways they're kind of related. The first element was that in the Russo-Japanese War, Japan, it still viewed itself as an up-and-coming power. It still looked up to, if you like, the Western powers, the European powers, as things to be emulated, because they were very conscious of the fact that not even a generation earlier, Japan had been, technologically speaking at least, very backwards. And Japan was very rapidly catching up, but Japan still had a way to go. They knew they were still, ordering their guns and their artillery from overseas, manufacturing some stuff in-house, but still, and, their capital ships were coming from British and French yards and all of this kind of stuff. So they were very aware of their place in the world, and therefore they looked to the powers that they perceived to be on the top of things as for kind of cues and guidance. Okay, how should we conduct ourselves? And of course, the Western European powers, Britain, etc., they had these codes of conduct, rules of war, and this was all seen as a very civilized thing. And the Japanese thought, okay, well, we are also civilized. We have a honorable civilization. Therefore, if this is how the top powers, the best powers say that people should act, then we should act this way as well. And bear in mind, a lot of the Japanese officers, both in the Army and Navy, would have been trained overseas. So they adopted essentially Western-style practices for treatment of prisoners of war. Fast forward to World War II, and in the interim, a few things have happened. Firstly, the extremely militarized Samurai Bushido Code has taken over, and pretty much all Japanese officers are now trained in-house, as it were, and a lot of them trained under this much more harsh interpretation of Bushido in the sort of interwar imperial Japanese culture. And obviously, when it comes to things like prisoners of war, that has very different values. The sort of the Western idea was your enemy has fought valiantly, he has defeated, but that could have been you. So kind of going all the way back to do unto others as you would have them do unto yourself. Treat them fairly as long as they abide by the rules as well. And everyone gets to go home at the end of the day, well, except for the people who died on the battlefield, but that's a separate matter. Whereas the slightly twisted version of Bushido that the Japanese had in the 30s especially was the superior person wins, the superior person has all the rights to do whatever they like, and the person who lost is inferior. Because they are inferior, they basically have no rights and should be looked down upon at best and viewed as essentially worthless and playthings at worst. And yeah, you can suddenly understand why the prisoners of war, who are like, oh, well, you have dishonorably lost, you're weak, you're inferior, you're scum, get out of my way kind of attitude comes from. The other element of it, I think, also comes from a more general cultural reaction to the late 1910s and early 1920s, because the Japanese, this unfortunately gets into the politics of racism, so who knows where this is going to end up with people potentially reacting or misunderstanding and reacting on the basis of that. But again, this is not my area of specialty by a long shot, but from what I have seen, from my limited view on that element of the social world of the late 1910s and early 1920s through the lens of naval officers and so forth, is that you had essentially two kinds of racism competing amongst the great powers of the world. You had a kind that said, this person is different from you, therefore you are superior to them because you are you and they are different, and therefore because they are different from you, they will always be inferior to you, and therefore you should always look down on them, and no matter what they do, they can never be as good as you. You can treat them pretty much like scum. This was the kind of attitude that you would see prevalent in things like chattel slavery, for example. The other form of racism was a more parochial one, which was, as far as I can tell, a kind of, everybody can be civilized, everybody can do things the correct way, TM, but some races are better at it than others. But because everybody is capable of that, while there are races that are inferior, because obviously you as the point of view person, you view your race as being the pinnacle of civilization, and of course if you're German, you think Germany is the pinnacle, and if you're British, you think Britain is the pinnacle, and if you're French, you think France is the pinnacle, and so on and so forth, but whatever. But these others who are less capable than you, less technologically advanced, less civilized than you, but they could become as civilized, they just need more help. This is kind of where the white man's burden thing comes in. And then when you get individuals or groups or organizations from these supposedly less advanced races, and they achieve things that are similar to what you as a civilized nation can achieve, that's almost worthy of more respect and adulation. Because, hey, if a British schoolboy grows up and becomes an inventor and makes a little bit of money off of his cleverness, well, yeah, very good for him. He's achieved something. Excellent. However, he's a British boy and he grew up in a British education system, and therefore this kind of thing is expected of him. Whereas if you have somebody from Kenya or India or Japan who comes over and they achieve a similar thing, they invent something and they sell it, then people can go, yes, well, these poor people, they came from a much less privileged background. They lived in mud huts or paper buildings, and they didn't know what civilization was before we brilliant British came and told them what it was. So, this guy's had a huge handicap, but he's come up and he's achieved the kind of things we would expect of our boys, and therefore, well done. You've made far greater strides. We applaud you for your inventiveness. You're a fine example of your race, which is slightly less oppressive than the other kind of, you're yellow-skinned, to hell with you attitude, but also very condescending at the same time. It's a very bizarre mindset. And this is why I'm not a social scientist, by the way, but this is basically my semi-informed opinion, having read a bunch of letters from various officers and men in the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, where they're discussing cooperating in, say, the Royal Navy in World War I, cooperating with the Japanese, or when I was at university and they celebrate the photographer Cesar Picton. You see this kind of thing quite a lot, particularly in British society, and by inference, I think it was a bit more common in European society as well at the time. But of course, you have these two competing ideas on the international stage, and the Japanese seem to have taken the latter idea and gone, okay, well, if we can prove ourselves, if we can be as advanced, as heavily armed, have just as good ships, just as good men, our conduct is just as civilized, etc., etc., we can prove that we are as good as, if not better, than the Europeans at this whole civilization thing, well then, based on the micro scale where they applaud individuals, then on a macro scale they will applaud us and say, oh yes, welcome to the high table of grand civilized civilizations. We are happy to have you here. We're all on a level. Excellent work, kind of stuff. And it turned out that for a variety of political reasons and also, frankly, some powers, adopting more of the first kind of more authoritarian racism, the Japanese were kind of disabused of the notion that they would ever be seen as equals by a good chunk of the great powers of the world in the 1920s. And they seem to have taken that rather badly and decided, at least, again, some of them decided, well, if they think they're better than us, well, actually, we are better than them because they're so close-minded they can't comprehend the idea of a man from Asia or a nation from Asia being as good as better than them. So therefore, they are actually our intellectual inferiors. We are the intellectual superiors. That means our practices are better than their practices. And therefore, as now we are the best, we can look down on them and we can treat them the way that they treat the people that they look down upon, with a side order of bitterness and a slight twist of very warped Bushido coding, and you get World War II Japan. Now, as I said, this is not my area of expertise. This is basically me inferring quite a bit from a limited perspective of the racial and socio-political worldview of the early 20th century on the basis of, as I said, a bunch of letters and correspondence and so forth from men at the time, but obviously a very limited slice of men at the time, mostly people involved in the navies. But that would be my answer, because that's based on what I know. And, well, as I said, if you happen to know better, because you've done a whole load of social political analysis of the early 20th century in relation to race relations and so forth, and you have a completely different idea, or you think I'm vaguely close to the mark, or whatever, please let us know in the comments below. Because, I mean, if there's another explanation, I'd be just as interested to hear it as everybody else, I think. Cody774 asks, I recently came across a picture of the light cruiser HMS Birmingham dated 13th of September 1916. The picture appears to show the ship with several triangular sails, each with holes through them mounted between the funnels. Are these in fact sails or signal flags of some sort, and what would their purpose be? There are a few photos of Birmingham in this setup. This is one of them. I suspect this is probably actually the one you've seen. And yeah, you can see there's a set of sort of Swiss cheesed triangles on the funnels. Now, these are not in fact sails. These are an attempt at a form of visual camouflage. Specifically, what the Royal Navy was worried about was that obviously the Germans, when they were firing at Royal Navy ships, would use their rangefinders to establish the range to an enemy vessel, the same way that the British would use rangefinders on the German ships. And so they tried to exploit what they noticed was a flaw in their own systems. So the British used coincidence rangefinders, as did, to be fair, most of the world. And a coincidence rangefinder works like the rangefinder on old-school 35mm film cameras. So you would have an image at the top and an image at the bottom, and they would be horizontally out of sync with each other. So you adjust your focus or zoom or whatever you want to call it, and when the two line up, so you have a continuous, coherent picture, then that means that the angle that you have the prisms of your rangefinder at is basically triangulating exactly at the range that your target is at. And you can have obviously mechanical systems built in that know, well, if this prism is at this angle and this prism is at this angle, or more usually it was one mirror or prism changing and the other being fixed, well, it knows that at this angle, that means the focal point is at this range. You go, okay, that's the range we need to fire at. Great, fantastic. The problem was, of course, it relies on the human eye, and it relies on things being able to be overlapped. So the idea of these triangles, and indeed several other triangular forms that you'll see on some other World War I British ships, was to break up the outline of ships and provide multiple competing similar visual reference points, which would then make it harder, in theory, for somebody to match up the two halves of the ship. And of course, if they get it wrong, then they get the range wrong, then they don't hit you. And this is all great in theory, except for one small problem. the Germans used stereoscopic rangefinders, not coincidence rangefinders, and it turns out that actually against stereoscopic rangefinders, the more complex shapes there are, the easier it is to actually get to recognize slight faults with the 2-image overlay that the stereoscopic rangefinder uses, and therefore actually technically it very slightly helps a stereoscopic rangefinder establish the range. And that's why they were only on there for a short while before they were taken off, because it was clear that they weren't really having any beneficial effect for the British, and then later on they'd figure out, oh, actually, it's actually, if anything, it's helping the Germans a bit. Eric Knapp asks, when did navies of the world begin to use white uniforms? They seem like they would be in a losing battle against the grime of the ship. Well, there's two important strands of white uniform to consider. You have dress whites, which of course as a dress uniform you just have to carefully maintain and clean anyway. And then you have your kind of working white uniform, which is a little bit more similar to what you would see here. And the introduction date varies depending on the navy, but generally speaking, the white uniform seems to pop up across various navies in the latter part of the 19th century. So the 1860s for the US, the 1870s for the Royal Navy, and so on and so forth. The reason for this is a combination of things. Firstly, you've got the increasing rise in, if you like, industrial cleaning chemicals, which make laundering white uniforms to stay vaguely white a possibility. Plus, you have a lot more ships on tropical stations, because you're in the heyday of the imperial period, and, well, a loose white uniform is a lot more comfortable in the tropical environment. And you also have the ever-growing widespread availability of cheap, bleached, therefore white, cotton, which is both very useful as a tropical uniform, because it's lightweight and breathable, and, well, the cheapest form of cotton cloth at the time comes in white or very close to white, because if you want to dye it, well, that's a whole extra process, and you're going to have to pay for that. So, yeah, they would get a bit mucky relatively quickly, but hey, that's what laundry days and multiple changes of uniform are for. As a dress white, so like any other dress uniform, you just have to hope for the best and do your best to keep it clean. Andre de Coult asks, hardly a Drydock episode goes by without at least one question's answer containing, this subject warrants a Wednesday video of its own. When you answer like this, do you automatically add the subject to your Wednesday video to-do list? And also, in your opinion, how many such questions actually have gotten their Wednesday video so far? Yeah, so I have a spreadsheet, and on the spreadsheet I have all the planned out 5-minute guides for the year, and around September, October I start populating it for the following year. And it also tells me which number Drydock I'm on, when the Patreon Drydocks are coming up, and the Wednesday and Friday video subjects as well. And then I have separately Word documents, and the Word documents have a very extensive list. You know, one has a list of all the ship or ship classes to cover in the 5-minute guides. The other has a list of subjects to cover in Wednesday or Friday videos. And what I'll do is essentially, when I'm planning, not an entire year's work, but when I'm planning the next year, I will copy paste around 36 topics into the spreadsheet for that given year. And then a combination of that, plus stuff that strikes me as inspiration during the year, plus ongoing series that I need to complete, becomes the backbone of roughly what Wednesday videos I'll cover. And then if urgent things come up, or I get a bolt of inspiration, that goes on as well. But yeah, when I say this subject warrants a Wednesday video of its own, it goes straight into the Word document list of subjects to cover. And in terms of how many such questions have actually gotten a Wednesday video of their own, I would say, it's difficult to tell because I don't specifically know, this was from a Drydock, this was from my own ideas, this was something somebody suggested, etc., etc. But I would say in the last 6 months or so, I can think of at least, I'd say, about a dozen times in the last 6 months where I've been preparing a Wednesday or a Friday video and gone, oh yeah, I remember this was a Drydock question that I pulled over into a full video format. So how many times that's happened over the course of the channel's lifetime, and how many other times I've just gone, oh, that's a good question, I think I'll or subject, I'll just do that today, without perhaps immediately realizing that, oh yeah, that was asking this particular dry dock. Well, a good number of dry dock questions, I would say, have had their Wednesday videos. Nowhere near all, but that's why I have a list that's 5 or 6 years long and growing. Alex Chang asks, "Hi Drac, Nicholas Whitson rather meticulously recorded a shell-first method of wooden ship construction in the mid to late 17th century. How did such a construction coexist with the standard plank-on-frame construction? Was this somehow an evolution of clinker-built hulls, and how long did shell-first construction last?" Well, there are advantages and disadvantages to both systems because, shell-first construction, to a certain degree, could be viewed as an evolution of the clinker-built hull, although there were clinker-built hulls that used frame-first construction as well. And then, of course, you've got the mortise and tenon systems used in ancient ships, which are also shell-first. Essentially, what it comes down to is, what is the main strength member of your ship? Is it the frame, and the planking is there to provide a bit of rigidity and to keep the water out, or is the planking the strength of the hull, in which case the frame is just there to stop it shifting around too much? Now, as I said, there are advantages and disadvantages of each type. The advantage of a shell-first construction method is that obviously you need a shell, hull, whatever, to keep the water out. But if this is also your strength element, then if your framework is just there to stop it shifting around all that much, your framework doesn't have to be particularly heavy, and therefore the overall result is a lighter ship. So you use less material, and therefore for a given volume, for a given potential displacement, you can put a lot more inside the ship. The disadvantage is that any damage that occurs to the outer shell is not just compromising your watertight integrity, it's also compromising the strength of your hull. And therefore shell-first construction is a lot more vulnerable to damage, a lot more likely to potentially fall apart, and of course in heavy seas, in transoceanic voyages and so forth, if your frame is relatively light, then if enough stress is put on the shell, even if it doesn't break, it can start to warp the internal frame, and then you have massive leaks and potentially, eventually, structural failure. A frame-first construction is stronger in absolute terms because you can use truly massive timbers for your frames. It's slightly less efficient in terms of weight of hull versus weight of stuff that you can carry, but it will stand up to a lot longer term battering and damage, and you can, generally speaking, build a lot larger with it. So if you're going to be building rivercraft, maybe coastal craft and small craft, there are actually a fair number of advantages to doing things shell first as opposed to frame first. But the minute you start to build significant size craft and you want to take them out to sea, or you want to take them out for extremely long periods of time, then you want to go to the frame first method. In some ways, you could almost look at it like mammals and insects at a very, very, very small scale, i.e., cockroaches, beetles, etc., etc. The shell first method of support, i.e. the exoskeleton, actually arguably works a lot better. I mean, a shrew or a harvest mouse is hideously more vulnerable to blunt force physical impact than a cockroach is, even though they might be, roughly speaking, the same size, depending on the species, of course. But as you start to scale that up, the frame first construction method of mammals like you and me becomes a lot more advantageous. I mean, there's also issues about oxygen exchange within animals, which is not a problem for ships, because obviously ships don't breathe. But more generally, if you ask a biologist, they'll tell you about all the potential weaknesses of exoskeletal creatures at a macro scale, like, creatures my size or your size or whatever, versus an internal framework like a skeleton. And it's very similar for ships. Stafford Magnus asks, how much further could a man in the crow's nest see than someone on the deck of a ship of the line? Using Victory, for example, assuming relatively calm sea states. So if you're on the main deck of HMS Victory, that's about 24 to 25 foot above the waterline, and of course then your eyeballs are further above the deck because of your height. So let's assume a slightly taller than average individual for the time, and let's round it out to a nice 30 feet. So your eyeballs are about 30 feet above the waterline if you're on the main deck of Victory. If, however, you're standing on the uppermost spotting position, position where you could stand for any particular period of time on the main mast, so that would be just below the upper yard, you can see here on the main mast, that would put your eyeballs about 160 feet above the waterline. It's 205 feet to the top of the mainmast, incidentally. So at 30 feet, you can see a little under 7 miles. Of course, you'll be able to see a little bit further than that because the ship will be bobbing up and down, so you might get brief glimpses out beyond 7 miles. And of course, you can theoretically begin to spot a ship beyond 7 miles because you'll see its masts and sails and rigging poke up above the horizon before you see all the way down to waterline hull level, which is what you would see at 6.5, 7 miles. Conversely, mathematically speaking, at 160 feet, you can see 15.5 to 16 miles. So you're talking about improving your distance by a factor of just over 2. It's about 2 1/3 times increase in spotting distance. But again, that is just for to the waterline spots, and therefore your capability of seeing part or a significant portion of an enemy ship at a considerably further distance is going to be a lot more than that, assuming good weather, plus of course a little bit of a boost occasionally from the ship rolling and pitching and so forth. Camino John asks, I came across a painting of a French sailor leaning against a 27 centimeter cannon on the ironclad Colbert by Gustave Bourgain, circa 1885. On the left of the painting, you can see revolvers and cutlasses hanging on the bulkhead. I know there's a possibility the whole painting is stylized with the painter's imagination, but did they really have such weapons ready in the 1880s? It seems farcical that either the French or English fleets would attempt a boarding action at this point in time. Did both navies actually think a boarding action would take place, and how reasonable was this assumption? Well, yeah, actually that's not stylized in the slightest. If you go aboard HMS Warrior today, okay, fair enough, Warrior is a slightly older ironclad than Colbert, but not by a huge amount, and it also has plenty of ready-use pistol and cutlass and rifle racks all over the place. And it's not just about boarding, although boarding was certainly potentially on the cards. I mean, boarding actions were still very much a thing that were thought of as a possibility. And to be fair, in the early part of the ironclad era, a boarding action is a little bit more practical than it would be later on, because as I've discussed previously with boarding actions, the fundamental elements for boarding require you to be able to get alongside long enough to get men across, which usually requires crippling the enemy propulsion system. Now, that is harder in an era when the engines are below deck, but you've got to remember that a good chunk of the early ironclads, their engines are auxiliary. They don't necessarily have the fuel to sustain themselves permanently out and about. They are still making quite extensive use of their sails, and as a result, they may be too far from home to use their machinery to get all the way back home, or they might not have their machinery powered up at that point and ready to go, in which case being able to control the upper deck and therefore the means of propulsion, i.e. the sails, is still a way to force a surrender of a ship. Now, of course, in theory, the engineering crew might choose to not honour that surrender and keep manoeuvring the ship from backup steering positions below and keep power going and choose to head off into the wild blue yonder, but then they are still subject to the same kind of considerations that an Age of Sail ship where the crew below decks refused to surrender would be subjected to, namely grenades and light artillery fired down or dropped down on them. Plus, you had other things like boarding actions to take prizes in the case of commerce or blockade warfare, and naval landing brigades and so forth, at which point you might as well have the weapons near the men who might be called to take on that process, rather than have them all have to go to a different part of the ship to pick up a bunch of weapons and then head out elsewhere. And obviously you've got to bear in mind that this is all in a period where people think ramming is definitely a way to go because it looks like perhaps armour is outpacing guns. Well, and if you're going to ram, well, you're also close enough to board. Lord Nelson asks, the Swedish naval architect Chapman designed coastal warships with a central battery for use in the Swedish-Russian War. How did those central batteries work, and how did they deal with the recoil of the guns? I'm not sure he did. If somebody knows a bit more and is prepared to point me in the direction of one, please do so. I'd love to be able to revisit the question if I'm wrong, but as far as I'm aware, Chapman designed some floating batteries, which were quite useful, towed into place gun emplacements and so forth. But in terms of the ships he designed, they did have guns on the centerline, but that didn't make them central battery ships. As far as I'm aware, his galleys and frigates that he designed, a good chunk of them, like the Udema class and so forth, would store their guns on the centerline so that they could be rowed, and the guns weren't getting in the way of the rowers. And then when it came time for action, then you'd haul in the oars and the guns could come out and they could fight with a full broadside. And that allowed you to have all the advantages of a galley and all the advantages of a full broadside frigate or whatever, without having to compromise either, at least in theory. And that was quite a cunning way of doing things, but that wasn't necessarily a central battery. It was a battery stored on the centre line when the ships weren't fighting. But as I said, if he did design some form of wooden central battery ship, I'd love to hear about it. Dave Collier asks, on the bridge of HMS Belfast, they used to play an audio recording of the crew during the Battle of the North Cape. On the recording, the crew gave the Scharnhorst the target designation Skunk Able. Why was this target designation used in the battle, and what was the Royal Navy's target designation system in World War II? This took a little bit of digging, and unfortunately the full gamut of the Royal Navy's target designation system in World War II is something I haven't quite been able to unearth yet. So if anyone knows a nice little handbook that the Royal Navy published that actually tells us that I can get my hands on, that would be great. Please let us know in the comments below. But with Skunk Able, I was eventually able to track it down. I couldn't find a trace of this designation in most research until I happened across the term in a completely separate bit of paperwork that I was reading about immediate post-war fleet exercises, where the term Skunk Able and the term skunk come up in separate contexts within the same exercise, but the clues are very obvious in that particular bit of writing. And essentially what it comes down to, it seems at least, is that skunk was the Royal Navy's designation at the time for radar-only ship contacts. So if you couldn't visually spot a target, but you could see it on radar, then this contact was designated as a skunk. And Able was the first. It's an A, so in US parlance they might use alpha or whatever. So essentially Skunk Able is your primary radar found and directed target. So when they're describing Scharnhorst as that, what they're saying is essentially, this is our primary target, we know it's Scharnhorst, but we can only see her on radar, and therefore we're steering to intercept and monitor her. Hark asks, in the guide to Richelieu, there's a photo of it where I noticed one of the gun barrels in the second turret is missing, or seemingly cut off near its base, as it has what looks like a short stub sticking out of the turret face. Is this because of repairs due to the explosion that occurred in the second turret? And if so, can you explain what the explosion was caused by and how severe it was? Yep, so here's a zoomed in portion of the photo, and you can indeed see that one of the guns ends in just a little stub. This is the result of the explosion that happened in that gun barrel. Basically, it completely wrecked the gun barrel, and so it was decided later on that, well, rather than having a useless half-destroyed gun barrel sat around, they're just going to cut off the useless bit and go with, as you see here. And obviously then later on, Richelieu fetches up at Brooklyn Navy Yard for refit and gets a new gun stuck in. In terms of what the explosion was caused by, one of the shells got stuck and detonated, or just flat out detonated, depending on which report you believe, in the gun barrel. This also damaged the gun next to it, immediately next to it, which didn't help matters either. In terms of the cause, initially it was suspected that it was something to do with the charges, because Richelieu was firing two kinds of charges at the time. She had a few of the originally designed charges for her aboard, but obviously she'd left without a full complement of charges and ammunition, etc. And at Dakar, where the engagement took place, there were a bunch of charges that had been prepared for the 13-inch guns of the Dunkirks, and so that propellant had been hastily repackaged into something approximating what they thought would be needed for Richelieu's guns. So they thought, well, you know what, we're firing a not in as intended propellant, maybe that has something to do with it. In actual fact, as it turns out, that redone propellant was the reason that she didn't lose more guns. I mean, she did have another explosion in another gun. It wasn't quite as severe, but the reason she didn't knock out her entire armament was because they had repurposed the charges from the Dunkirk. So what the actual culprit was that the 15-inch shells for Richelieu had been designed to have cavities in the base so that they could be filled with poisonous gas. Obviously, you would only insert the poisonous gas canisters in events that you wanted to induce chemical warfare on your opponents, and that was a fairly severe situation, which the Battle of Dakar was not. So the shells had been fired, but that meant the cavities were empty, and the build-up of pressure from the propellant as the guns were being fired got into that cavity, obviously because it was empty at the base of the shell, and then split the shell apart, causing premature detonation, and, well, so long for that gun. In the end, they decided the best way of solving that particular problem, once they realised what it was, much later after the Battle of Dakar, was to fill the bases of the shell where you had this cavity, fill the cavity with cement and cap it, so you didn't get that dangerous build-up of pressure. The reason why I say the repurposed charges were the salvation of the ship were because it turned out the repurposed charges were a little bit too weak compared to what was called for Richelieu, and thus the other guns, which had been firing obviously a combination of repackaged and pre-existing charges, the pressure when you fired one or more of the repackaged charges with the regular ones was less than had been designed, and therefore didn't overstress the shells and cause them to explode. So clearly either a large majority or potentially all of the charges used when that particular gun fired were the original spec charges, and then firing at full pressure the shell just went boom. So yeah, weirdly enough, the thing that they originally blamed for the problem was actually the reason they didn't have that problem as much as they otherwise would have. Pedden Harley asks, Drac, while the current generation of AI generally fails to create believable naval history-related photos, it's not hard to imagine this changing with time, and manipulated photos already exist. Would you mind sharing a bit how you source and vet historical photos for your videos, and, if you wish, how you imagine that might or might not change as technology evolves? For example, I recently saw someone post an image of a privately owned photo of the deck of an American Civil War era revenue cutter. Historically, it was of interest because it showed the arrangement of the boat howitzers on the deck. I had not seen the image or one exactly like it before, but it looked correct and I'm reasonably confident it's authentic. But 10 to 20 years from now, might any of us be so confident?
Well, it is something of a problem for naval historians to ponder as time goes on.
Especially when you consider that what you just heard was an AI clone of my voice. That's disturbingly accurate. Oh well, at least I know I've got a backup in case I don't know, get throat cancer or something. But I have been keeping an eye on AI image generation technology as time goes on, and every so often when a big new update comes out, I'll feed it a set number of questions that I've derived from a naval theme, like show me the Battle of Trafalgar, show me a World War II destroyer battle, things like this. And while, as you say, it's still not there, it's getting a lot closer. You know, back when I started asking those questions a couple of years ago, the stuff it generated was so hilariously obviously not even any kind of recognizable ship, that let alone Trafalgar-era ship of the line, that it was just laughable. Now, it can generate something that, if you were just to glance at it, would plausibly look like a Napoleonic-era ship of the line, and you actually have to start looking for details like why has it got 4 masts, and things like this before you realise that it's AI generated. So, and if that's 2 years, well, by the end of the decade, who knows what they'll be capable of. But in terms of where I get the majority of my photos from, it's a whole range of sources. So obviously, the various reference books that I have photos in them, so I can check where those photos have come from. Then you have vetted sources, so somewhere like Naval History and Heritage Command, Imperial War Museum, NavSource, the website, etc., and various other sites such as that, where they've already done the legwork to vet at least that the photo is authentic, and most of the time they've got the identification right. Not necessarily 100% of the time, but most of the time. Or if there are photos publicly hosted which are known, as in there are multiple copies of them all over the place, everyone agrees what they are, it's fairly obvious what they are if you know what you're looking at, and more often than not there's a citation back to the original source, then I could use those. But on top of that, I also have an extremely large private collection, and that's made up of verified digital copies that I've collected from various places, plus photos from private collections that people have allowed me to scan and use, plus my own personal collection of physical copies, which I haven't scanned all of them, but I'm in the process of scanning them, and then obviously able to use those as well. So recently I managed to acquire another bunch of photos that via auction, which is essentially it's not one photo of every ship, but it's at least one, possibly more, photo of every single British warship and auxiliary from, Warrior's time to the present day. And I'm looking at that collection now, and if anyone of you is familiar with the Really Useful Box Company, well, if you know what one of their 35-litre capacity boxes are like, that's 3 35-litre capacity boxes absolutely rammed full of photos, and those boxes are heavy, let me tell you that much. And that's probably 4-5% of my personal collection. And to be honest, the biggest problem with that whole collection is not necessarily knowing what the ships are, because either I know by looking at them, or I can just look at the caption that's been provided with them, depending on where they're from. It's more finding the time to actually carefully scan and label and upload them all. Although I will say, while we're on the subject briefly, one thing that does immensely irritate me is that there are some photo hosting companies online, Alamy in particular is a big offender in this regard, who seem to use bot scrapers to just take photos from wherever and put them on their system, stamp their watermark over them, and then claim it's their copyright and you have to pay them to use the photos, when it's blatantly not. It's stuff that's been public domain, for example, because it's US Department of Defense, let's say US Navy photos from the Second World War. This is stuff that's been published in multiple books over decades, some very, very commonly known photos. It's hosted on places like Naval History and Heritage Command and NavSource. Everybody knows this is public domain photography, and either some bot or someone, without Alamy doing it their due diligence, has uploaded some version of it to them, and often, hilariously enough, multiple copies attributed to different creators, and stuck it up, and they said, no, this is ours, you have to pay us for it. And occasionally I've had to deal with them, but in every case I've been able to turn around and say, actually, this is the original source, it's public domain, it doesn't belong to you. If it belongs to anybody, it belongs to either the Royal Navy, the UK government Crown copyright, or the US Navy, US Department of Defense. If you want to go arguing with them and tell them that you've stolen their property and are trying to charge people for it, have fun with that. And shockingly, you never hear from them again after that. Peter Guy asks, in a YouTube video produced by a Canadian historian I found to be very reliable, he recounted the history of a pom-pom artifact at a museum in Canada. As part of describing the history of pom-poms, he contrasted it with the US Navy's decision to go with the Bofors instead, which, as you noted, was a very close decision. He noted 2 key factors, including muzzle velocity, But the other factor was something I'd never considered, that the pom-poms required cordite as a propellant, which wasn't manufactured in the US at the time. Do you know if this is true, and what would it have required for the US to retool its armaments factories to produce cordite if necessary? He is right, that was cited as a reason for not adopting the pom-pom, although it wasn't the deal breaker that some have presented it as. It was a factor that weighted against the pom-pom, and in combination with a few other issues, including, as you said, a lower muzzle velocity, it influenced the decision to go with the Bofors. The Bofors had its own downsides, including the fact they essentially had to strip the thing down and rebuild it in mass manufacture capable components, whereas the original Bofors was pretty much a handcrafted solution. In terms of actually manufacturing the gun, the pom-pom would have been much quicker to put into production. But the fact that cordite wasn't at that time produced in the US wasn't a kind of a complete no, we can't do this. It was just, it's another complicating factor that we'd rather avoid if we could. It wouldn't have needed to retool existing armaments factories to produce cordite if they'd gone with the pom-pom. To be honest, given how many additional plants they built, I think they probably just would have built another factory and said, right, here's the raw materials, make cordite for us. And they could have gotten help from the British with that, because obviously the British knew how to make cordite by that point en masse. And cordite wasn't exactly a unknown propellant. I mean, to be honest, given the amount of work they did, as I said, stripping down and simplifying the Bofors, they might as well have also gone and worked out how to do the 40mm pom-pom round in an alternate propellant they already manufactured. But nonetheless, you've got to remember that making an entirely new kind of explosive for the war wasn't exactly outside of potential for the US, because Torpex, very famously used by the US in vast quantities, basically neither it nor some of its component chemicals were manufactured much at all in the US prior to the Second World War. Torpex was developed quite a while before the Second World War in Britain, because along with TNT and powdered aluminium, its primary component is RDX explosive. RDX was also invented in Britain. In the 1930s, the US produced very, very little RDX and therefore could not produce Torpex. But then when World War II came around, thanks to the exchange of technologies, they went, oh, we like your Torpex, right. Factories, guess what? You're making RDX now. And then the US went on to be the world's largest manufacturer of RDX, and therefore also manufactured truly insane amounts of Torpex and stuck it in torpedoes, and off went the torpedoes to send plenty of Axis ships to the bottom. So the idea of the US going, actually, you know what? We need another kind of explosive for this thing. It's not entirely out of the question. It was just in the negative column for the Bofors and so for the pom-pom, and therefore helped to tip the scales in favour of the Bofors. Wyoming Iceberg asks, follow-up question to A.B. Coates' question in Drydock number 337, which nation's pre-dreadnought battleships and individual ships performed the best, as in brought the most honour to the class, over the class's total active service lifetime? My vote would have to be Mikasa and for the Japanese, although an argument could be made for Schleswig-Holstein. But what is your opinion? Well, you see, going over total active service lifetime, that does weight things considerably towards ships that actually had a very long active service lifetime. And although Mikasa's been around for a very long time, I'd actually argue that potentially she's not so much in the running. Because yes, of course, she did great service in the Russo-Japanese War, but then that's pretty much it. I mean, okay, she exploded and sank and then had to be refloated again, but after that, she doesn't really have any significant frontline role. So she's kind of a, not quite one and done deal, but almost. And the rest of her good service just comes from continuing to exist. Whereas in terms of utility for a navy, well, of course, you've got the famous US Pre-Dreadnought that's turned into a crane ship and therefore has a fairly long and very active and useful service life in the US Navy. Schleswig-Holstein, of course, and to a lesser extent Schlesien, are around for the First World War in Jutland and all that kind of stuff, and then fire the opening shots in World War II, and somewhat implausibly, are still around towards the close of the war in 1945. And then, of course, you've got the Lord Nelson, the semi-dreadnought, which has service off of Gallipoli. It has various other bits of active service in World War One. Then it goes on to be a radio-controlled target ship for a good long time. The Dantons, theoretically, could be up there because, I mean, they don't have any particular major battle honours other than the massive mob action against the poor old Austro-Hungarian light cruiser. But they, again, unlike most pre-dreadnoughts, managed to last through into the interwar period. So, I mean, in terms of did the most over a relatively long service life, I think it's probably hard to beat Schleswig-Holstein and Schlesien because they did something in both world wars, which is more than could be said for the vast, vast majority of pre-dreadnoughts, with the exception of that rather useful crane ship. And considering that Schleswig-Holstein's contribution to World War II was, as I said, to start it, I think I'm going to go with the crane ship. The Judge 2017 asks, the Iowa class has a very famous photo of the only time they all sailed together. There's also some video footage, actually. Do any other ship classes of more than one ship have their pictures taken together in a family photo with all members of the class together? And what might be some examples of getting close but missing only one or two ships? Well, there are a bunch where it's fairly easy to cheat. You know, it's easy to find pictures of both Duilios in the same place, and similarly pictures of Renown and Repulse, lots of two-ship classes. I almost said the Cavours, then I remembered, of course, Leonardo da Vinci exploded and sank fairly early on, so finding a picture of all three Cavours together is a little bit more difficult. It's also possible to find photos of Littorio and Vittorio Veneto together at the time when they were the only two Littorios in service. Of course, it's not possible to get pictures of all the King George V's together, because by the time Anson and Howe entered service, Prince of Wales was already sunk. But thanks to the advent of aerial photography, there's actually quite a number of photos, which may not be just the class in isolation, but photos that certainly have an entire class of ships in them. You've got some of the famous line-ahead photos of both British and American ships. There's various aerial photos where you can see, you know, both Fusos, both Isseis, both Nagatos, sometimes all the Congos. There's loads of Spithead and Gibraltar photos, especially of large portions of the British fleet, which obviously a lot of the time you get Nelson and Rodney in the same photo, but you'll also very often see the entirety of the Queen Elizabeth or R-class in there. Some photos from US Navy fleet problems and from Pearl Harbor you'll quite often see in whole classes there, although that's relatively easy with most of the standards being only two ships strong with the exception of the Colorados and the New Mexicos. And quite a few photos of Scapa and of the British fleet at sea in World War One, which will give you some of the four-ship classes all in one photo as well. Jack Ray asks, would World War II German destroyers have been better off with 105mm dual-purpose main guns compared to surface-only 150mm guns? Despite my general reservations about the 105mm or 4-inch gun being perhaps a fraction too small for destroyers, given the liveliness of the gun platform, as compared to the stable and higher mountings you can get on capital ships, with the German destroyers that mounted the 150mm, I think I would make an exception, because those 150mm mounts made the German destroyers so top-heavy, it was a bit ridiculous. And on top of that, they were almost unworkable in heavy weather, which is not a good thing if you're a destroyer. Plus, of course, they have minimal anti-aircraft defense. And even if you did a straight swap with the capital ship 105mm mounts, which are obviously somewhat heavier than they would be if you adapted them for destroyer usage, for a ship like this, where you have the twin 150 forward and then three singles aft, total weight, you know, that twin up front is 60 tons on its own, and collectively the armament weighs about 120 tons, which means that even if you straight swapped in capital ship grade twin 105mm mountings, you could put four of them, so you'd get 805mm guns, and you'd actually be saving 15 to 20 tons in weight, which is a fairly large amount to have high mounted on a destroyer, which would solve an awful lot of problems for them. And I suspect that if you actually tried to do a destroyer version of the twin 105mm mount, you could probably get that down to about 20 tons, which would mean that you'd actually be able to get perhaps 10 guns in 5 twin mounts, if you could find the deck space for them, and still save weight on most German 150mm armed ships. And at that point, 8 to 10 guns that have both an anti-aircraft purpose and can actually be fired in something other than a flat calm, versus 4 or 5 guns that make you top heavy and can only be fired when you're not in rough seas. That's probably a pretty good trade-off. Rodney McCoy asks, I have a question regarding the British Empire. During both World War conflicts, exactly what were the resources coming from the vast empire that was so vital to Great Britain herself? How were they used, and did they justify the massive expense that was the Royal Navy? Well, it depends on the war, of course, but you had all sorts of things. You had manpower coming in from virtually all corners of the empire, both in terms of general infantry, which was obviously quite welcome, but also in the terms of some pretty skilled individuals as well. Now, I'm not saying that an infantryman is unskilled, but a fighter pilot, for example, is a considerably higher and harder to get skill set. And, so you had manpower of varying descriptions. You had raw materials, rubber from Malaya, for example. Later on, oil from various British overseas possessions, obviously keeping things running that way. There was a degree of raw materials. Food, of course, was an absolutely massive one. Grain, meat, etc., to keep the British Isles fed. And especially in World War II, part finished or finished goods. I mean, there's huge aircraft production lines in Canada, for example. And, I mean, there was aircraft and tanks and ships being built there, and in Australia and other places. Small arms, explosives, ammunition, etc., etc. The list of resources that came in from the Empire was absolutely vast. There was actually very little that was produced in the UK that wasn't also produced in some quantity somewhere else in the Empire, and some things, like Malayan rubber, which couldn't be produced in the UK, and therefore would only be able to come across from the Empire. Now, did that justify the massive expense that was the Royal Navy? Well, that's a whole question as to whether or not the British Empire itself was justified, which I think is a whole other question for another time. But looking at it purely from a resource perspective, yeah, the amount of resources that Britain could command, or in World War II ask for, from overseas, which being resources that either they didn't have or didn't have in quantity or needed more of, even if they could produce it in large numbers themselves. For a small island nation that wanted to play on the top table, they absolutely needed them, and therefore they absolutely needed the Royal Navy. Hunter Park asks, would you know if any pre-World War II Japanese planning or wargaming sources equivalent to stuff like Plan Orange in the US existed? Did the Japanese fleet run exercises akin to the fleet problems of the US to assist with those? Yes, there were, although there were essentially 3 tiers to Japanese planning, and only one of them received any kind of major attention. The first tier was, we're going to war with somebody whose navy is so small, or at least their naval presence in the Pacific is so small, that we're just going to mercilessly roll over them. We don't really need to plan for it. We've got overwhelming superiority. So, let's say they wanted to take French Indochina off the French, for example. So that didn't need a lot of planning in their view. Then you had essentially war with Britain at the next stage, because Britain theoretically could have a navy that was bigger than Japan's in theatre and had an industrial capability larger than Japan's, but historically didn't have a navy anywhere the size of Japan's present in the area. So the Japanese ideas for that was, well, we get some rough outlines of plans here and there, but honestly, we can probably take out what the Royal Navy's got in the area relatively easily, and it'll take them so long to either come up with replacements or reinforcements if their ships in the area fall back, that we can think of detailed plans on how to deal with that later down the line. We'll just put some minimal work into that. And then the third option was fighting America, and that was 95% of pretty much all Japanese interwar planning, because America had a fleet that was bigger than theirs, and the majority of that fleet was for most of the time based in the Pacific, so it was very obvious that that was the biggest threat and the most likely scenario for Japan to be at war with pretty much anyone, where they actually thought they'd have to apply more than one brain cell to the planning situation. So yeah, while the US had Plan Orange to fight Japan, the Japanese didn't need a rainbow of plans. They just needed, here is our plan to fight America. Here is our revised plan to fight America. Here is our revised plan to fight America. And so on through pretty much the entirety of the 1920s and 1930s. And yeah, they did run big fleet exercises to try and work on their tactics. Of course, they had doctrines like anti-Cassen and so forth, but how exactly they were going to execute that, they would think about it. And then they'd practice those things like night attacks with torpedoes, developing new long-range torpedoes, massed air attack, and so forth from carriers. And all of this would be developed through a series of fleet problems. I mean, the Fourth Fleet incident, where they discovered that a bunch of their ships were dangerously top-heavy and dangerously underbuilt structurally, occurred during a fleet exercise. And finally, having answered approximately 100 questions in approximately 6 hours, JT Daily Update asks, "Hey Drac, could you give a brief overview of the Holman Projector that the Royal Navy used, and did it score any kills?" So the Holman Projector was actually a cunningly simple plan. The Holman Company, which mainly worked in pneumatics, decided it wanted to contribute towards the war effort, and its contribution to the war effort was remembering a fairly simple mortar system that had been developed back in the First World War. They thought, we'll make a pneumatic mortar system that just straight up fires hand grenades at people, specifically aircraft. Now, it wasn't going to have the world's greatest range, but, well, a hand grenade is a pretty substantial thing to be lobbing through the air at aircraft compared to even 20 or 40 millimeter rounds. And it was discovered that since the hand grenade exploding in midair produces a very large puff of smoke, it could, at short range, give the impression of a disturbingly powerful anti-aircraft gun present on a ship. And because the Holman Projector was fairly rapid fire, I mean, you could chuck grenades with the Mark I, you could chuck a grenade downrange roughly at a rate of 30 grenades a minute, and they're incredibly cheap and easy to make. You can mount multiple of them, even on a basic merchant ship, and if you've got 3 or 4 of them enthusiastically chucking grenades skywards, if you're a German pilot, then out of nowhere, this absolute carpet of large explosions and the pinging sound of fragments rattling off the aircraft, if you're lucky, suddenly appears. You're thinking, what on earth is this ship armed with? Or does it have friends nearby that I've somehow missed? Maybe I should attack from a further distance away, and obviously that means less accuracy, and that means the ship might survive, or the pilot might decide he's going to attack something else that isn't firing large amounts of explosive with great enthusiasm in his direction. Holman went on to develop the Mark II projector, which could fire even faster and was capable of firing multiple rounds from each blast. There were pneumatic versions and there were steam-powered versions, and the Mark II had greater range as well. So you could very enthusiastically send a very large number of essentially hand grenades, or as they call them, Mills bombs, at an attacking aircraft very easily. They were not the world's most accurate things. They were just a smooth-bore iron or steel pipe, essentially. But to be perfectly honest, when you're talking about a basic hand-aimed anti-aircraft thing at close range, it didn't really matter. And to be honest, the hand grenades actually gave you a relatively large blast radius as well. So believe it or not, yes, the Holman projectors did score a number of kills and quite a lot more damages, and a very large number of aircraft who decided they'd rather be somewhere else, and therefore the ships survived through that method, even if the aircraft wasn't shot down. The other very useful thing about it was being a large caliber smooth-bore pressure mortar. You weren't restricted to just firing grenades. It was essentially, can this thing fit down the barrel, and does it occupy at least a decent chunk of the area of the barrel in profile as the thing goes down? If yes, the Holman projector can fire it. So empty beer bottles, potatoes, decent-sized rocks, the occasional chunk of snow or ice, pretty much anything you wanted to send at relatively high velocity the enemy's way could be done with a Holman projector. Now, of course, something like a 20mm Oerlikon or 40mm Bofors is actually considerably more effective at the whole shooting the enemy down element of it, but as something of a deterrent and as a last-ditch weapon, which is much better than having no weapon at all, the Holman projector was pretty darn good. And So quite several thousand of them were developed, produced and installed on various ships across the British fleet, both merchant and Royal Navy. And yeah, it was a very, very good inventive idea, and I kind of want one. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the conclusion of, I think, our first 100-question dry dock. That's taken a while to record, and it's, 6 hours of content, so that'll keep some of you awake and alive on long-distance road trips and so forth. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. If indeed you still are and you've gotten to this stage, and see you again in another video.